Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip silently into the velvet-draped drawing rooms and incense-heavy chapels of 18th century Italy, where grief wasn't always quiet and widowhood could launch you into the social stratosphere. Picture it, candlelit, streets echoing with the clack of heels, black lace rustling like secrets behind closed shutters, and every glance at a widow's veil was laced with equal parts sympathy and suspicion. You're not here to mourn, you're here to understand how loss could turn into leverage, how grief could become a career, and why you definitely wouldn't want to marry into certain Florentine families, unless you had a strong constitution and a spare will in your pocket. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. Let's see who else is staying up with ghosts tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the cobbled alleys of Naples, lantern flickering weakly against the early evening fog. Somewhere between the clamor of fishmongers packing up and the echo of mass bells, a new silhouette glides by, tall, graceful, and clad entirely in black. Not a nut, not quite a noblewoman. You catch the sheen of silk beneath the veil, the subtle scent of lemon water and cloves. She's a widow, and not just any widow, an 18th century Italian widow, in this time and place. That means she's something of a social contradiction, both pitied and pursued, adored and avoided. And you're about to find out why that lace curtain isn't just for show. In much of Catholic Italy during the 1700s, women had few paths to autonomy. Marriage meant transferring from a father's household to a husband's control. Unmarried, women were often shuffled off to convents, whether they wanted to take the veil or not. But there was a loophole, grim as it was widowhood. When your husband died, especially if he left a respectable estate behind, you didn't just get black clothes, you got freedom. A terrifying kind of freedom, maybe, but also intoxicating. You could now manage property, run businesses, make decisions, and even refuse new suitors with a dismissive flick of your fan. Some even negotiated directly with the church. Imagine going from ornamental wife to full-blown CEO of Grief Inc. overnight. Of course, not every widow came out on top. A good chunk of them were poor, rural, and more likely to end up back in their family homes with extra mouths to feed and no dowry left. But in the urban centers, Venice, Florence, Rome, something shifted. Here, being a widow could mean you were back on the social market. But with interest, you were experienced, you'd proven fertile hopefully, and you came with a built-in sob story that made even minor scoundrels feel like gallant rescuers. And perhaps most importantly, you often came with land, or jewelry, or political connections. Sometimes all three. Suddenly, your tragedy was looking like a marketing campaign. There's a phrase from the 1730 Neapolitan diary that goes, "She cries for him with one eye and shops with the other." It was probably meant as a jab, but it accidentally captured the duality of the time. Widows were expected to grieve, and many did fiercely, sincerely, but they also knew the game. Mourning wasn't just emotional labor, it was public performance, and the costume mattered. Deep black for the first months, shifting to gray and lavender in time. Fabrics could signal status to coarse wool for the poor, but jet-beaded crepe and dyed silks for the rich. You didn't just dress for the dead, you dressed for the living watching you mourn. Historians still argue whether this performative grief was more empowering or restrictive. Some say it gave women a temporary mask of legitimacy to act more freely. Others say it was another leash, just one dipped in velvet and sprinkled with rosewater. What's clear is that people were watching and judging. A widow who mourned a little was called cold. One who mourned a much might be called hysterical or manipulative. The sweet spot, just enough tears to look sincere, just enough grace to keep your options open, and people did want options. Remarriage wasn't uncommon, especially for young widows still in childbearing years, but it was rarely urgent. Why? Because some widows liked their new situation just fine. Imagine suddenly not having to cook for anyone, manage a moody in-law, or risk childbirth every 18 months, and imagine if you had money to hire a housekeeper, or enough status to ignore petty gossip. You could read, host poetry nights, take lovers discreetly, of course, or not. Some did scandalously little to hide their affairs, especially if their late husbands had left no heirs, and the in-laws had already backed off in defeat. And here's a lesser-known twist. Widows could be terrifyingly fashionable, the image of the quiet, cloistered crone, not in Rome's Trastevere district. There, a certain Donna Livia, widow of a tax minister, was known for her customized mourning gowns with deep crimson linings meant to flash only when she turned just right. Gossip mongers whispered that she matched her underthings to the lining. Whether true or not, it worked. She turned down 3 suitors, one of them a bishop's nephew, and spent most of her evenings hosting musical salons that had more political chatter than arias. Widowhood was also a class marker. The rich had the resources to mourn publicly, beautifully, and often strategically. Poor widows, not so much. They might wear a tattered shawl, borrow black from a cousin, and rely on neighbors for food. But even among the poor, some found unexpected agency. Think of La Nera, a fishwife from Genoa who turned her dead husband's stall into a mini empire, eventually controlling 3 market stands and bribing local officials with baskets of sea urchins. French tidbit: one police report from 1774 accuses her of inciting unrest with salted language and seductive mourning attire. She was fine. She paid in oysters. By now, you're probably wondering, was this all just the Italians being dramatic? Yes and no. Drama was certainly part of it, but so was survival. Widowhood gave women a rare taste of decision-making, and in a society where being born female usually meant being managed, married, or muted, that taste could be addictive, especially when it came in a package of black taffeta and unexpected suitors. You're still following her, this enigmatic figure in black, through a narrow Florentine arcade, half lit by oil lanterns that make the shadows look like they're whispering secrets. Her veil brushes the stones as she turns, not too fast, not too slow. She's not just in mourning, she's putting on a show. You wonder, how often does a woman like this bury a husband? And more importantly, how often does she come out of that graveyard a little richer, a little freer, a little more dangerous than before? Welcome to the world where death wears silk, and sometimes it wears it better the second time. Brown, in 18th century Italy, especially among the merchant and noble classes, husbands were always a heartbeat away from checking out early. War, disease, stress, duels, rotten dental care. Life expectancy for men, especially the ones with titles and tempers, wasn't great. And when the husband croaked, guess who took center stage? His widow. Not just a grieving wife, but suddenly a powerful figure in the household, with legal rights and public sympathy clinging to her like the scent of myrrh and mildew from a church crypt. Because when you die in this world, you don't just leave behind your name and debts, you leave behind a widow. And she just might do a better job at managing your estate than you ever did. But don't get too sentimental. Not all marriages were love stories. Many were contracts with corsets, strategic alliances sealed with dowries and cold expectations. Widows, particularly those in upper-class circles, often found themselves genuinely relieved after the death of their spouses. Not that they'd admit it openly unless you caught them during their 3rd glass of Marsala wine, whispering behind a fan. And the estate, oh, that was the real game changer. See, under certain legal customs, especially in places like Venice and Naples, wealth didn't revert back to the husband's family. Instead, it went to the widow to manage, at least until any male heir came of age. That could mean years of power, income, and control over everything from tenant disputes to olive oil production quotas. That kind of control was intoxicating, especially for women who, mere weeks earlier, couldn't even attend a town meeting. Suddenly, you're the boss of the vineyard, the matron of the villa, the one courtiers ask favors from. Imagine going from yes, husband, to yes, but you'll need to schedule that with my steward. It's no wonder widows became lightning rods for admiration, jealousy, and a fair bit of suspicion. There's a court record from Palermo in 1748 where the son of a recently deceased merchant accused his stepmother, a widow, of just 3 weeks of hiding his father's ledgers and controlling the warehouse keys. She countered by saying the son was unfit to run a donkey cart, let alone a business. The court ruled in her favor, whether she was right or just politically savvy. The record shows she maintained control until her death, by which point she tripled the estate's profits. So yes, silk wasn't the only thing she wore well. Of course, none of this power came without a price. Public opinion was a fickle lover to successful, and you were a schemer to withdrawn, and you were probably plotting to beautiful in your grief, and you were definitely up to something. One Venetian gossip tract described a certain widow as having a smile that forgot her husband. Before the grave dust settled, it sold like hotcakes. And yet, that same widow went on to host literary salons attended by foreign diplomats and artists. wielding cultural power her late husband never dreamed of. There's a lingering debate among scholars about whether these widows were truly independent or just temporarily tolerated. One camp argues they were placeholders for sons caretakers of assets until the real heirs arrived, but others point to court documents, letters, and business records that suggest many widows continued to manage affairs long after the heirs were technically of age. One Milanese widow, Signora Bartolomeasi, refused to cede vineyard rights to her adult son until he showed less interest in gambling and more in grape rot. Legend says she made him apprentice with the vineyard's head farmer before handing over a single barrel. In many towns, especially those thriving on trade, like Genoa or Livorno, a widow could be the de facto mayor of her district. She paid wages, approved contracts, and even settled disputes among other merchants. Her house became the place where decisions got made, and if you wanted something done, you went through her. The Black Veil didn't hide her influence, it advertised it. And here's where it gets even more curious. Some widows didn't just inherit their husband's wealth, they enhanced it. In Bologna, a woman known only as La Vedova Rosa took over her late husband's spice trade and expanded it into a cross-Mediterranean operation, importing saffron, clove, and rumor has it, a bit of opium on the side. She never remarried. She didn't need to. She lived another 30 years, employing over 40 people, and was once seen riding through the city on a palanquin more Ottoman princess than grieving housewife. The French tidbit, one foreign envoy wrote in his diary, "I do not know if she is a saint or a witch, but I would ask her for a job before asking God for mercy." That's the power you're dealing with, and it wasn't just about money. Prestige mattered too. Some widows commissioned artworks, established schools, or donated heavily to churches. It wasn't all Machiavellian maneuvering. Some genuinely believed in giving back, but even then, a well-placed donation could serve multiple purposes. It soothed the soul, honored the dead, and reminded the community that the widow in black wasn't just mourning, she was still moving the pieces, and those pieces included potential new suitors. Yes, the marriage market didn't close for widows, especially if they were young and wealthy, but they held more cards this time. They could choose, or delay, or refuse entirely, and that refusal, that's where power really bloomed. It was one thing to be admired. It was another to say no and watch them keep admiring anyway. Some would-be husbands tried to court through flattery, poetry, or gold. Others tried legal tricks or family pressure, and every now and then, a truly desperate suitor would try fake piety, claiming he only wanted to protect the widow from the cruel world. One widow from Siena reportedly responded, "The cruel world is quieter when men like you aren't speaking in it." She stayed single. Good choice, because staying single didn't mean staying alone. Widows often formed tight circles, friend groups, business alliances, even informal political networks. They supported one another, loaned money, shared intel, and sometimes plotted together. Power wasn't just something they inherited, it was something they maintained, and often multiplied. You pass another doorway, where an oil painting shows a widow holding a book instead of rosary beads. The inscription reads, "In silence, she ruled," and you believe it. This isn't just grief, it's strategy wrapped in satin. You follow her still, your steps quieter now, more respectful. Something about the way she moves, not hurried, not hesitant, tells you she's used to being watched. Used to whispers curving through corridors, to glances lingering just a second, to long. The widow has become not just a survivor of loss, but a figure of fascination. And in 18th century Italy, fascination often carried a price tag. Tonight, she wears black, but it's not the black of despair. It's the black of curated, allure, of deliberate enigma, because this isn't just mourning, it's branding. You see, in this century, fashion wasn't about chasing trends. It was politics stitched into velvet, power hemmed in lace, and for a widow, every fold of her mourning attire spoke volumes. The first phase, called luto stretto, or strict mourning, demanded heavy black garments, no jewelry, and downcast eyes. But that was just the opener. After 6 months or so, the rules allowed for mezzo luto, half mourning. Here, colors like lavender, gray, and mauve could re-enter the wardrobe. The lace might lighten, the jewelry return, first jet, then pearls, then diamonds. And with every shift in shade and texture, the message was clear. The widow is transitioning, not forgetting, but moving forward, elegantly, slowly, alluringly. In a society obsessed with ritual and hierarchy, a widow who dressed properly wasn't just demonstrating taste. She was showcasing discipline. A woman who could mourn beautifully, was seen as emotionally intelligent, socially aware, and perhaps most dangerously capable of wielding restraint and seduction at the same time. Think of it as the slow burn of the Baroque world. Historians still argue whether this elaborate, mourning dress code was designed to protect widows from predators, or to help them attract new suitors under controlled conditions. Maybe both. After all, society didn't really know what to do with independent women, especially ones who controlled property, so it draped them in veils and codes, giving them a script to follow. But many widows rewrote the script mid-performance. Take, for example, the legendary Countess Bianca Salviati of Ferrara. Widowed at 31, she followed every mourning rule to the letter for her first year. Then, suddenly, she appeared at a church gala in a violet satin gown embroidered with tiny black skulls along the hemline. Some claimed it was macabre, others called it genius. Either way, the bishop publicly praised her theatrical piety. Behind closed doors, 3 dukes requested an introduction. That's the strange paradox of the time. Grief made fashionable could be deeply erotic. The image of the grieving woman, vulnerable yet poised, distant yet visible, sparked something in the cultural psyche. She was no longer an obedient daughter or a chaste bride. She was transformed, and that transformation created a particular kind of magnetism. The widow became a symbol of depth, of mystery, of survival. And because she had already been married, she was presumed to have knowledge, worldly, emotional, and yes, sexual. While virginity was still prized on paper, the reality was more complicated. Many men saw widows as ideal companions, experienced enough to understand them, refined enough to manage a household, and legally free to choose. A widow had no father to answer to, no dowry negotiations to endure. If she liked you, she might accept your hand. If not, she'd smile politely in return. To her embroidery, her vineyards, or her secret letters to someone more compelling. And suitors came in all forms. Some were other widowers looking for companionship. Others were younger men, eager for status and financial security. But some were simply attracted to the mystique. There's a record from Padua of a widow in her late 40s who received daily poems from a university student half her age. She never responded publicly, but she did fund the construction of a new library wing, naming it after the mythological muse of history, Clio. Scholars still debate whether that was a subtle nod to her admirer or a savage ghosting. The fringe tidbit: that student eventually became a professor and lectured on Greek poetry for 20 years. He named his daughter Clio. The layers run deep, but not all attention was poetic. Some widows found themselves pursued by less savory characters, scheming cousins, desperate noblemen drowning in debt, even opportunistic priests who saw saving a wealthy widow as a career move. That's where fashion again played a role. The veil, for instance, was not just a symbol of grief, it could also serve as a barrier, a signal, a shield. Women learned to use it like armor, a flick of the fan, a certain way of lowering the eyes. A tilt of the head. These gestures became an unspoken language to the right observer. They said, "You may admire, but from a distance." Others were more direct. A certain Florentine dowager reportedly had a habit of inviting overly aggressive suitors to tea and serving them pastries laced with a mild purgative. No permanent damage, just a vivid lesson in boundaries. She remained unmarried for 25 years and became something of a local legend. The performance of mourning also included rituals beyond clothing. Public masses for the dead, for example, often became social events. A widow might sponsor elaborate music, commission artworks, or distribute alms, all in her husband's name, of course, but everyone knew these gestures also reinforced her own social standing. Mourning became a kind of resume. Here's how much I loved him, and here's how well I run things now that he's gone. And yes, sometimes that love was real and raw. Many widows did suffer deeply, but even then, the rituals offered structure, something to hold onto, a roadmap through the chaos of loss. And in that structure, some women found space to rebuild not just their lives, but their identities. The theatricality wasn't necessarily dishonest. Sometimes it was survival in a world that demanded performance from women at every turn. Even grief had to be pretty, poetic, and productive. But occasionally, the fouet cracked. One Neapolitan widow famously burned her mourning wardrobe after exactly 1 year, declaring, "I will no longer dress like death to feel alive." Scandalized neighbors sent letters to her priest. The priest responded with a single line, "She has given enough." Whether he meant to be spiritual or just tired of gossip remains unclear. What is clear is that this era's widowhood was not a pause, it was a stage, and on that stage, each woman decided how to play her role. Some played the saint, some played the queen, some played the game so well they wrote their names in the local legend without ever lifting a sword. And now, as your mysterious guide in black disappears into an archway, leaving behind only a faint trail of lavender perfume and crushed rose petals, you realize you haven't seen grief tonight. You've seen transformation. Grief was the curtain, what came after was a real performance. You find yourself now drifting through the echoing chambers of a villa. That's far too large for one woman, yet she commands it effortlessly. Every servant moves at her glance. Every vase and tapestry is arranged just so, and you begin to realize that this house, this quiet, stone-faced mansion isn't just where she lives. It's where her value lives too, because in 18th century Italy, widowhood wasn't just a shift in emotional status, it was a real estate upgrade. And not in a metaphorical sense. Property laws were the unseen gears that turned mourning into money and turned some widows into miniature monarchs. Let's break it down. In much of Italy during this period, especially under systems of Roman and ecclesiastical law, when a man died, his property didn't automatically revert to his children, or even his brothers. If he was married, and especially if there were no adult male heirs, a significant portion, or in some regions, all of his estate went to his widow, at least temporarily. This wasn't out of some proto-feminist impulse. It was mostly about control and continuity. Land needed a steward, assets couldn't be frozen indefinitely, and widows were often the only legally recognized managers available. But whatever the reason, the outcome was the same, a surge in power. Suddenly, the same woman who once needed her husband's permission to host guests or sign a contract could now oversee vineyard operations, collect rent from tenant farmers, or lease out family homes. She was, legally and financially, a serious player. Historians still argue whether this shift actually improved long-term conditions for women, or simply delayed male succession. Some believe widows were merely placeholders for sons, expected to step aside gracefully once the boy reached maturity. Others point to cases where widows held onto property for decades, even rewriting wills to favor daughters or trusted nephews instead. What we know for certain is that land was power, and widows had it. There's a recorded case from Pisa in 1760 where a widow named Lucia Accorsi refused to sell a parcel of vineyard land to her late husband's cousin, despite considerable pressure. When he tried to take her to court, she produced a notarized deed proving the land had been a part of her dowry, and therefore fully hers. She didn't just keep the land, she expanded it, eventually acquiring the neighboring groves and becoming one of the region's most respected olive oil exporters. Her label bore a small, elegant black ribbon on every bottle, a reminder of where the fortune began. Of course, not every widow had Lucia's legal foresight. Many entered inheritance battles that could stretch for years. Italian family structures, at the time, were famously tangled full of second cousins, half-siblings, and suspiciously timed adoptions. And when money entered the picture, alliances shifted faster than a gondola in a rainstorm. Enter the lawyers. Entire firms specialized in managing widow estates, drafting contracts that ensured women retained at least a portion of their property if they chose to remarry. Yes, that's right, getting remarried didn't automatically void a widow's claim to her first husband's assets, but it could if the paperwork wasn't tight, and that's where strategy came in. Smart widows hired notaries and clerics to protect their holdings, ensuring that any new marriage didn't become a hostile takeover. In some regions, prenuptial agreements were less about romance and more about survival. One widow in Siena even included a clause stating that if her second husband attempted to sell her vineyards without her written consent, he'd forfeit his rights to their shared property and be sent to live in her least profitable estate, go farm in the hills known for its aggressive roosters. He stayed in line, but beyond legal wrangling, there was also the reality of space widows often physically inherited the home, the hearth, the entire center of family memory. That meant people came to her, relatives, business partners, churchmen, all of them had to enter her space, eat at her table, wait in her vestibule. Symbolically, this shifted power in ways hard to overstate. A woman who controlled the estate controlled the narrative of the dead, the fate of the living, and the rhythm of daily life. And that rhythm mattered, because property wasn't just about wealth, it was about ritual. Owning land meant hosting Saints' Day feasts, managing harvest festivals, maintaining family chapels. The widow became the axis of tradition, the one who remembered who gave what, which uncle hated which cousin, which grapevine grew best in which corner of the orchard. Without her, the estate might collapse into infighting. With her, it endured. In fact, some widows became so essential to estate management that their children petitioned the church to allow them to avoid convent retirement, citing indispensable domestic authority as the reason. And yes, the church often granted it partly because they understood the social fabric, partly because these widows donated generously. The French tidbit: one archive in Modena lists at least 6 widows who sponsored bell tower repairs in exchange for eternal mass readings in their name. 3 of those towers still stand, but with great property came great paranoia. Some widows were accused of witchcraft, of using enchantments to keep land from male hens. These accusations were rarely prosecuted by the 18th century, but the whispers endured. A wealthy widow who refused to remarry was often assumed to be hiding something, usually, according to neighborhood gossips, a secret lover or a cursed amulet, or both. One woman in Palermo was famously accused of bewitching the lemon trees on her estate to resist being sold. Her defense: if my lemons prefer my hens, that's between me and God. She won the case. The property stayed in her name. So yes, real estate wasn't just profit. It was identity, legitimacy, and social leverage. Widows who held land held stories, entire landscapes of memory that they could choose to preserve, transform, or weaponize. And weaponize they sometimes did, refusing to lease land to a rival son, hosting church feasts that conveniently clashed with an enemy's wedding, planting hedges to block a former suitor's view of the sea. Petty, perhaps, strategic, always. And remember, this is in a world of instant communication. Gossip traveled by letter, by servant, by sign. A single change in a lease agreement could ripple through town for weeks, feeding dinner party rumors and parish intrigue, and behind it all sat the widow, sipping lemon cordial in her marble courtyard, pretending not to hear. She didn't need to shout. The land spoke for her. Every stone and pomegranate tree whispered her authority. And that authority, unlike beauty or youth or even grief, lasted. It held steady through decades. Because while mourning dress faded and love letters were burned, property stayed. It anchored her in a world eager to forget widows the moment their veils dried. But with land beneath her and keys in her hand, she wasn't just remembered, she was required, necessary, even feared. So as you step into the cool tiled atrium of her villa, surrounded by frescoes of saints and silken tapestries imported from Naples, you don't just see a woman in black. You see a ruler, one who didn't need a crown, just a deed. You're seated now in the dim corner of a marble loggia, watching as the widow receives her visitors. They come in waves, each more rehearsed than the last. Clergymen clutching rosaries, minor nobles polishing compliments, merchants pretending not to angle for loans. But beneath their polite bows and borrowed poetry lies a common thread: they all want something. Something she holds, something they think they can charm or gild or spiritually coax out of her. Because a widow in 18th century Italy, particularly one with assets and a decent complexion, was more than an object of admiration. She was a target, a prize, a riddle wrapped in widow's weeds, and not everyone who came knocking was noble. It turns out that grief, properly accessorized, drew suitors like a honey trap in a hornet farm. You had the desperate aristocrats, second sons who had inherited nothing but debt and a family name to prop up. You had the priests, wrestling with their vows, who somehow decided that saving a beautiful widow was just this side of divine intervention. You had cousins of cousins, riders of dubious lineage, failed soldiers, even old tutors trying to rekindle something that never burned. In the first place, they all had one thing in common: they underestimated her. See, the mourning veil didn't impair her vision, it sharpened it. If you'd spent years navigating the moods of a husband twice your age, managing servants, dodging family politics, and maybe secretly reading banned French novels, you probably had a decent sense for detecting insincerity, and the widow knew what she was worth. She was aware that her status, her control of land or liquid wealth, made her a magnet for opportunists, so she learned to play along, just enough to gather information, just enough to stay amused. Historians still argue whether this suitor circus was seen as flattering or exhausting. Some believe it offered widows a rare kind of agency, a menu of possibilities to sample or dismiss. Others suggest it was simply a new form of pressure different from marriage, but equally suffocating. Either way, it was real, And sometimes it was absurd. There's a recorded episode from Florence in 1759 in which a friar, newly defrocked for personal lapses, took it upon himself to woo a wealthy widow under the pretense of spiritual counseling. He brought her daily letters comparing her grief to Mary Magdalene's devotion, and included original psalms composed in her honor. When she failed to respond, he escalated to writing a play in which he, thinly disguised as a wounded knight, saves a goddess in grief from a burning convent. She responded by inviting the entire town to a dramatic reading except him, the fringe tidbit. She cast a woman to play the knight. The message was clear, and it wasn't just personal. Attention widows had to juggle. The economic value of widowhood created professional matchmaking industries. Family members, especially brothers, uncles, and older sons, often acted as unofficial talent scouts, trying to broker remarriages that would consolidate power or erase debts. One Naples family in 1772 offered their widowed sister as a marriage solution to a creditor, complete with a revised payment schedule. She declined. Her reason? His breath smells like mortadella and desperation. That story survived not in legal records, but in a family diary scribbled in the margins of a prayer book. But sometimes, the pressure came from within. A widow might feel the weight of legacy, the haunting whispers of her late husband's name, the ticking biological clock of a society obsessed with heirs. There were moments of real conflict between wanting autonomy and craving connection, between protecting assets and wanting a partner. Some remarried, many did not, and those who didn't often created their own social ecosystems. Think salons, poetry readings, theological debates over wine and oranges. Widows weren't just collecting attention, they were curating it. They chose who entered their circles, who received favor, who was quietly frozen out. A skilled hostess could turn a garden brunch into a miniature parliament, and if she so happened to meet a man who intrigued her well, she could act on it, quietly, carefully. Not every relationship had to lead to marriage. One Venetian widow became infamous for hosting a rotating series of musical protégés, all male, all under 30. She provided lodging, mentorship, and occasionally matching waistcoats. People whispered. She smiled. Her concerts were always well attended, and let's not forget the symbolic power of the widow's gaze. There are accounts of women using the act of unveiling lowering their mourning veil at a public event as a silent declaration of availability. No speeches, no formal announcements, just a shift of lace, a glimpse of eyes. It was enough to send rumors spinning like silk reels. And yet, in all this social maneuvering, some widows still face real danger. Not every suitor took rejection well. Some turned vengeful, filing bogus lawsuits, spreading malicious gossip, even attempting theft or sabotage. One Milanese woman reportedly woke up to find her garden trampled and a piglet wearing a bridal veil tied to her front gate. The message, "Marry me or marry this." She didn't laugh. She bought a new gate and made it higher. But not all conflict came from the outside. Sometimes it came from the widow herself, from the internal struggle of balancing independence with vulnerability, of knowing that affection could never be truly separate from status. The freedom she gained from her husband's death was thrilling, yes, but it was also lonely, and love, however dangerous, still whispered at the edges of that solitude. Still, most widows preferred their solitude seasoned with power, rather than diluted by dependence. They learned to savor companionship without surrender. They died with poets and diplomats, danced at festivals, corresponded with old flames. And occasionally, just occasionally, they did fall in love again, quietly, maturely, on their own terms. One particularly fierce widow from Verona reportedly married her estate's former steward, in secret, revealing the union only in her will. When asked why she kept it hidden, she replied, "I wanted at least one thing in life to belong only to me, and that's the heart of it." Really, these widows weren't relics of tragedy. They were architects of their next chapter. Their suitors came armed with roses, rosaries, and real estate offers. But the power to choose or not always rested with the woman in black. Behind every flirtation, every veiled glance, every accidental garden walk, there was a calculus. Be he run in silence? Is he worth the risk? Will this alliance serve me, or serve someone else? Because a widow had already been through the most final kind of goodbye. She didn't fear loneliness like others did. She feared losing herself again. So she stayed vigilant, selective, maybe a little wicked, and very, very awake. It's late now, and the streets outside are quiet, but the widow's house hums with a different kind of energy. You're in the drawing room now, just out of sight behind a marble pillar, watching as a servant adjusts the candles, not too bright, not too dim. On the far wall, portraits of dead husbands peer out with dull, judgmental eyes, while beneath them, their widow arranges her ensemble for tomorrow's procession. Not a wedding, not a ball, but something stranger, a funeral, and not just any funeral, a funeral with seating charts, because in this world, mourning isn't a period of retreat. It's a public performance, and you are always being reviewed. Funerals in 18th century Italy were something between a religious rite and a theatrical event. The richer the deceased and, more importantly, the richer the widow, the more elaborate the affair. It started with the body, of course, usually laid out in the finest room of the house, dressed in formal attire, hands posed like a marble saint. But it didn't stop there. You had the candle procession, the music often a custom composition by some desperate composer, the monks, the incense, the street closures. There were even official mourners, sometimes hired if family members weren't dramatic enough. And central to all of it, whether in veiled silence or tearful collapse, was the widow. Her role was critical. She had to balance dignity with despair, visibility with restraint. One wrong sniffle, one too lively step, and she'd become the talk of the city, and not in a good way. But when done right, her presence could elevate the entire ceremony. She wasn't just mourning the dead. She was demonstrating that she knew how to play the social game to perfection. Historians still argue whether this focus on theatrical mourning was about genuine emotion or a form of aristocratic branding. Some say it helped channel grief into ritual, giving families a way to cope through structure. Others say it was less about grief and more about reputation, about ensuring that every guest knew the deceased had mattered and that his widow mattered more. Either way, the results could be jaw-dropping. One Neapolitan widow famously staged her husband's funeral with an 18-piece orchestra, live doves released over the cathedral, and commemorative prayer books printed on imported French parchment. It reportedly cost more than a year's harvest from their vineyards, and it worked. She was flooded with condolence letters, marriage proposals, and business partnerships within the week. Some called it excessive, others called it genius. She called it necessary. But not every widow had that kind of budget. Among the middle classes, creativity often filled the gap. Families pooled resources to host modest but memorable services. Women stitched their own mourning gowns, embroidered with discreet initials or religious symbols. Music students played for free, partly for exposure, partly for access to wine and gossip. A certain tailor's widow in Bologna became infamous for serving pastries shaped like coffins. At her husband's wake, they were delicious. People still asked for the recipe. French detail, the icing contained black licorice and rosemary, meant to symbolize sorrow and remembrance. It's not just about the spectacle, though. Funerals served a strategic function. They brought people together, relatives, creditors, clergy, rivals, suitors, and in that crowd, a smart widow could make introductions, settle debts, launch rumors, or even finalize deals. Think of it as a networking event in a crypt. And the widow, she's the keynote speaker, whether she speaks or not. After the funeral, mourning didn't end. It just morphed. The widow's home often became the new social center. People paid condolence visits that stretched for months. Some brought gifts, fruit, lace, books of scripture. Others brought questions. Who would inherit what? Would she stay in the villa? Would she remarry? She answered only what she chose to. Sometimes her silence was more powerful than any reply. Fashion also evolved. As we covered earlier, mourning had phases, but each phase had subcodes. The first 3 months, absolute black, no exceptions. After that, a subtle introduction of muted grays, maybe a string of pearls if your husband had died honorably. A slow return to color was not just permissible, it was expected. It signaled recovery, strength, availability. A widow who wore black to long risked appearing frozen, melancholic, even suspicious. People might whisper that she enjoyed her grief a little too much, or worse, that she had caused it. That's where mourning became its own form of espionage. You had to wear your sorrow just right, not too loud, not too soft. One Roman etiquette guide from 1771 advises, a widow must present her sadness with elegance, but never weaponize it, lest she become more ghost than guest. That sounds poetic until you realize it was written by a bishop, who later tried to marry to different widows. He failed both times. Beyond fashion, mourning extended to household decor. Mirrors were often covered, clocks stopped, and musical instruments silenced. But these signs of grief doubled as statements of wealth, covering a mirror in fine lace. That's not mourning, that's merchandising. And when mourning ended, when the veils were lifted and color returned, there was a party, sometimes small, sometimes grand, but always intentional. It was a re-entry into society, a signal that the widow was back, watching, choosing, unspokenly announcing, "I have not vanished." One Milanese widow even had a custom perfume created for her first public appearance. Post-mourning, it combined amber, violet, and myrrh, according to a guest's diary. She entered like the closing line of a tragic poem, and every man forgot the preface. The timing of this reemergence was critical. Too soon, and you were insensitive. Too late, and you were irrelevant. But just right. That's how legends are made, and for many widows, this carefully timed return was more than social, it was political. You had to show you could still navigate the world, still command a room, still matter, especially if you plan to remarry, fund a school, expand your estate, or most scandalous of all, live independently. Funerals, mourning periods, even the emotional choreography of grief, they were all steps in a strange, slow dance that can either liberate or ensnare. And for the clever widow, they were also tools. Each gesture, each choice, each barely noticeable accessory was part of a larger design. The performance of sorrow had power, and when that power was wielded by someone who knew the game, it was breathtaking. So now, as you leave the drawing room and step into the garden courtyard where orange blossoms fall silently, while on black marble, you realize you haven't just seen a woman surviving loss. You've seen a strategist, a performer, an architect of image, a legacy. The funeral was a stage, the mourning a mask, and behind that mask, a mind that never truly slept. The air changes as you move into the older wing of the villa colder. Somehow, despite the flickering warmth of nearby sconces, the hallway smells faintly of wax and dried herbs, and behind a half-opened door you glimpse rows of ledgers and folded letters, locked drawers and dusty bottles. This is no salon, no sitting room for polite grief or poetry readings. This is the engine room, the part of the widow's world you're not supposed to see. Because while society admired the widow for her restraint and style, they sometimes forgot just how much control she wielded behind the scenes. Some used that control gently, others not so much. Here's the truth no one liked to say aloud in 18th century Italy. Some widows knew how to make people disappear socially, financially, even physically, and no, not all of them did it alone. That's where veils, vodka, and vigilantes come. In the veil, you already understand. It's grief's camouflage, a kind of social invisibility cloak that let women observe, plan, and maneuver without scrutiny. But vodka, that's less poetic. In Naples, Florence, and Palermo, some widows gained reputations not for their mourning poems, but for their sharp business sense. As sharper beverages, distilling spirits was legal, profitable, and incredibly easy to mask under the guise of household medicine. A widow might be brewing digestive bitters by day and bottling high-proof grappa by night, distributing it through loyal servants and making more profit than her late husband ever did. With grain, one Senese widow even sold remedy wine that doubled as both cough syrup and political lubricant. If you drank it, you were more likely to vote for her nephew in the next guild election. Coincidence? Maybe. Historians still argue whether these private brewing operations were acts of financial desperation or calculated social climbs. Either way, they worked. And then there were the vigilantes. You didn't think all those suitors just gave up quietly, did you? Some widows, especially those living outside major cities, had to build private defense networks. These weren't sword-wielding ninjas, more like fiercely loyal cousins, ex-soldiers, or peasants whose children she had fed during lean winters. Call them enforcers, call them companions, call them house staff with suspiciously strong arms. And no known last names, these were the men and women who made sure the widow slept peacefully. And when she didn't, someone else didn't either. There's a letter from 1781 in which a Neapolitan widow writes to her sister, "Tell Paolo that if he shows his face again, the cat will go missing." He'll know what that means. We don't know who Paolo was. We do know her cat was seen sunning itself in the courtyard for years after. Whatever threat Paolo represented, it evaporated. The French tidbit, that widow went on to fund a school for girls and was later declared blessed by the local bishop. Benevolence and intimidation weren't mutually exclusive. The tools of power, after all, often shared the same drawer, and sometimes the widow didn't need physical protection. Sometimes She had blackmail. In a society where secrets were more plentiful than olives, a well-connected widow could gather an impressive collection of iOS, love letters, gambling receipts, and whispered confessions. It helped that she hosted salons where wine and poetry loosened tongues. It helped that servants were observant, loyal to coin, and often fluent in gossip. One Venetian widow allegedly kept a book of favors, a velvet-bound ledger of indiscretions owed. Collected and pending, it was never found, but everyone in her district behaved very carefully around her. You might ask, how could a grieving woman turn into a puppet master? Easy, she had time freed by the absence of a demanding husband, time to listen, time to learn, time to plot. Widowhood, while seen as a loss, was also a blank page. Some women wrote love poems, some wrote revenge lists, and if you were clever enough to do both, congratulations, you were unstoppable. Some even dabbled in more experimental pursuits. The 18th century wasn't quite the age of reason everywhere. In rural regions and old cities like Lucca or Bari, herbalism, superstition, and folk remedies blended seamlessly with Catholic ritual. Widows often became the keepers of these half-sanctioned traditions. They grew herbs for grief, collected bones for remembrance, and knew which prayer to say over which illness. Most of this was harmless, but occasionally, the line blurred. In 1776, a widow in Calabria was accused of enchanting her rival's livestock after a land dispute. The rival's goats allegedly stopped producing milk. The widow said nothing publicly. Privately, she told a cousin. The goats didn't like being watched at night. No one pressed charges. This kind of reputation could be dangerous, but also strangely protective. If people feared you might curse their crops or write them into a book of enemies, they tended to leave you alone or bring you gifts. And for some widows, this was preferable to courtship or compliments. Fear, after all, was just another form of respect. But let's not drift into caricature. Most widows weren't mixing poisons or running espionage rings from their linen closets. They were simply smart women in a society that assumed they'd be quiet, and when they weren't, when they pushed boundaries or returned threats with carefully timed consequences, people remembered. In Perugia, a widow named Clarissa ran her late husband's grain business with an iron ledger. When a local official tried to extort her, she reported him for bribery and enclosed his own letters as evidence. He was removed. She was promoted to city grain auditor, a role previously held only by men. When asked how she managed it, she said, "I'm good at math, and people like bread." Her rise wasn't mysterious. It was logical. But logic doesn't make for good gossip. So of course, rumors spread. That's another thing widows had to manage the narrative. A single missed church service, an unchaperoned visit, or a new garden statue could spiral into scandal. So they got ahead of it. One Roman widow kept a rotating cast of visiting priests on her estate, always with impeccable credentials and always treated just coldly enough to squash rumors. She didn't need spiritual guidance. She needed plausible deniability. Historians now call it grief diplomacy, the art of balancing public morality with private autonomy. And some of these strategies passed down. Letters between widows reveal mentorship, advice, even templates for managing household accounts, legal disputes, or romantic entanglements. It wasn't just survival, it was legacy. So as you move through that quiet hall of shadows and ledgers, past the veils and the dried lavender bundles, you understand this isn't about paranoia. It's about power. Soft, quiet, strategic power. Not the kind that comes from swords or scepters, but from knowledge, loyalty, and time. The widow you follow tonight, she isn't just a character in Summian. You wake, not in your bed, but still drifting through the corridors of her villa though this time. It's not the marble, not the velvet, not the candlelit quiet that strikes you. It's the way the air shifts when you pass through the chapel. You pause. It smells like beeswax, stone, and the faint trace of frankincense that never quite leaves the plaster. A woman kneels at the altar, her silhouette familiar, our widow again, spine straight, veil pulled just low enough to maintain mystery. But this isn't the grand cathedral downtown. This is private, personal, and that right there, that's the tightrope. Because in 18th century Italy, widowhood wasn't just a legal or social state. It was a theological minefield. The Catholic Church held contradictory opinions about widows. On one hand, they were paragons of virtue, the women, who had fulfilled their sacred duties and now lived in chaste mourning, closer to God than ever before. On the other hand, They were dangerous, sexually experienced, socially mobile, and, worst of all, unattached. No husband to control them, no father to marry them off. Just a woman and her will. And in a world built on hierarchy, that was unsettling. Church doctrine praised the holy widow, an ideal rooted in early Christian saints who renounced the world after their husbands' deaths, taking up prayer, charity, and sometimes even cloistered life. Saint Monica, mother of Saint Augustine, was the poster woman for this ideal long-suffering, devout, dignified. Many clergy expected widows to follow this template: minimal socializing, perpetual black, and, if possible, a generous donation to the church in exchange for eternal prayers. But actual widows often had different ideas, because while the church encouraged piety, it also encouraged property transfers, and widows, unlike monks or virginal brides, had property, lots of it: land, titles, jewelry, heirlooms, and yes, the church wanted its slice. So you had this delicate dance priest counseling widows on morality, while simultaneously encouraging spiritual generosity. Some widows played along, funding chapels, endowing altars, commissioning stained glass windows. Others were more strategic. They gave just enough to buy goodwill, but kept their wealth where it could still move. Historians still argue whether the church's obsession with widows was spiritual or economic. Was the constant pressure to remain celibate about holiness? Or was it about preserving a woman's identity as a passive donor, rather than an active political player? Probably both. And some widows took advantage of that ambiguity. They hosted Jesuits for dinner, flirted with friars over theological debates, and made confession such a dramatic event that other parishioners gossiped about the theatrics. One widow in Mantua even received a private letter from her bishop, encouraging her to reduce her charitable works if they were drawing unnecessary male attention. She responded by throwing a banquet for orphan girls and inviting the bishop's secretary. The message was received. The French tidbit? She had the letter bound and shelved in her library under fiction. But not all widows enjoyed this freedom. For every wealthy landowning woman, there were dozens more, under church scrutiny, especially if they were young and attractive. Widows under 30 were considered at risk of temptation and tempting others. They might be pressured into entering a convent, either directly or through inheritance threats. Families sometimes pushed this, preferring their daughters to retire behind stone walls rather than remarry into rival houses, and once inside, escape was rare, unless, of course, you were resourceful. There's a record from Palermo in which a 26-year-old widow escaped her convent by disguising herself as a nun from a different order. She joined a passing pilgrimage group and wasn't discovered until she'd already remarried a wealthy vintner in Genoa. Her justification: "I have already buried one man. I do not intend to bury myself." The church, predictably, was furious. The local court fined her, but the Pope later reduced the punishment, citing her pragmatic faith. Widows who resisted convent life had to walk a narrow line: to secular, and they'd be labeled immoral; to pious, and they'd be expected to vanish into cloisters. But those who managed the balance, who hosted religious events, without being devoured by them, became cultural powerhouses. They funded orphanages, dictated morality plays, commissioned religious art. Their salons became places where theologians, poets, and merchants debated virtue over marzipan. These were not silent, grieving women. These were orchestrators. One widow in Venice reportedly organized a Lent series so moving that multiple nobles attended daily, not to repent, but to hear her commentary afterward. She sat in the back, never interrupting Mass, but afterward, she hosted an afternoon session of discussion and tea. It was invitation only, and in the church's eyes, it was tolerable as long as she kept paying for the incense. Some clergy genuinely supported widow independence. A few even helped them manage estates, protected them from predatory suitors, and advocated for their children's rights. But just as often, clergy were part of the pressure machine trying to steer widows into roles that maintained church authority. One Tuscan priest was known to visit wealthy widows with pre-written wills tucked in his coat. If the widow seemed pliable, the document came out. If not, he'd offer to pray for clarity and return later. He was eventually removed after a bishop found 3 nearly identical bequests with his handwriting. The kicker: 2 of the widows were still alive. This didn't stop others from trying similar tactics. Widows became practiced at spiritual deflection, offering donations in memory of their husbands, making public pilgrimages, or sponsoring choir boys in exchange for divine protection. These gestures maintain the illusion of compliance while keeping power in their hands. Even more fascinating is how widows used the church's own language to defend themselves. Some quoted scripture, others wrote theological treatises. One Milanese widow published a pamphlet arguing that the Virgin Mary's independence after Joseph's death was the spiritual blueprint for all Catholic widows. It caused a scandal. It also sold out. And yes, the bishop condemned it publicly. While quietly requesting a copy, you can still find it in private archives, bound in red leather with handwritten marginalia, possibly his. But theology aside, there was something deeper going on, an emotional reckoning. Widowhood brought not just loneliness and legal shifts, but spiritual questions. What did it mean to still pray for a man who may not have loved you? To light candles for a soul while wondering what yours would become? Many widows struggled with this dissonance. Some found comfort in ritual. Others grew quietly resentful. And a few, just a few, declared their souls their own. One wrote in her diary, "They tell me to pray for him. I do. But sometimes I pray for myself louder. That's not rebellion. That's reclamation." So now, as the widow in the chapel finally rises, smoothing her veil, you see not a woman bowed by faith, but one negotiating with it, making space inside doctrine for her own voice. The candlelight flickers. She turns. For a moment, she looks directly at you. Then the light shifts, and she's gone, leaving behind only that faint trail of incense and something more difficult to name: autonomy, maybe, or defiance dressed in devotion. The morning breaks, not with fanfare, but with the soft sounds of slippers on terracotta tiles and the clink of silver against porcelain. You trail her again, this widow who never quite seems to sleep, into a breakfast room where sunlight filters. And like a polite guest, and the coffee is already steaming, thick and black, sweetened just enough to take the edge off reality. She sips without looking up. Her letters are spread before her, tied with ribbons in neat bundles, some brown with age, some suspiciously recent. Because this, right here, is what the clerics and cousins don't talk about. This is money, cold, quiet, calculated, and the laws behind it, even colder. In 18th century Italy, widowhood didn't just come wrapped in black crepe, it came bound in red tape. The moment a husband died, a strange thing happened. The woman who had once needed his signature to open an account was now at the center of a financial tug-of-war. Her in-laws wanted inheritance claims. Her Natal family wanted their dowry returned. The church wanted donations, and the state wanted taxes. Widowhood, for all its supposed sanctity, was taxed differently, literally, depending on the region. A widow could be required to pay a special estate fee, a religious tithe, or even a moral guardianship levy meant to protect her virtue. Through the supervision of appointed male relatives, in Florence, there was even a bureaucratic category called delicate custodianship, which allowed courts to appoint a financial overseer. For young or distractible widows, unsurprisingly, these overseers were almost always uncles with gambling habits or brothers-in-law with debt. Some widows played along. Others fought back with a paper trail of receipts, ledgers, and conveniently timed bribes. Historians still debate whether these taxes were about order or oppression. Did they stabilize a fragile social economy, or did they just keep widows in a state of permanent, taxable limbo? What's certain is that clever widows learned the system fast. They hired notaries, memorized loopholes, and used their late husband's signatures to finalize just a few more transactions, always dated. Before death, of course. French tidbit: one widow in Genoa famously filed 5 contracts posthumously signed by her late husband. When the court questioned the timing, she calmly replied, "He was always late with his paperwork." They let it slide. But it wasn't just about dodging taxes. It was about maintaining control. Dowries, you see, weren't gifts, they were investments. When a woman married, her family often paid a sizable dowry into the marriage. Upon her husband's death, custom dictated that the dowry or part of it be returned. In theory. In practice, it became leverage. Families used the threat of dowry retraction to influence the widow's choices. Don't remarry. Don't sell the vineyard. Don't host that charming ex-priest at your poetry night. Some widows complied. Others withheld repayment until appropriate behavior was reciprocated. That's the thing about these women. They learned that currency wasn't always coin. Sometimes it was information, or loyalty, or silence. One Neapolitan widow famously delayed returning her dowry for 4 years, until her brother agreed to grant her niece permission to study medicine in Bologna. The niece later became one of the first women to practice formally in her province. The taxmen, meanwhile, waited and waited beyond dowries and death taxes. There was also the subtle economy of appearance. A widow was expected to maintain her household, her staff, her wardrobe, her events even during mourning, especially during mourning. To cut costs publicly was to suggest financial instability, and that invited vultures, so women kept up appearances. They bought on credit. They negotiated with lace merchants for discreet discounts. They wore black, silk not just out of grief, but because it aged better than wool. They understood that maintaining dignity was an investment, and some invested spectacularly. One widow in Lucca financed an entire almond harvest by wagering her sapphire ring. Against the predicted rainfall, she won. She doubled her profits. She had the ring reset with a black diamond. Now that's grief management. But the economic landscape wasn't always tilted in their favor. For every success story, there were women cornered into remarriage or financial ruin, especially if they lacked children, legal support, or literacy. That's when community became critical. Some widows formed informal cooperatives sharing resources, lending grain, co-signing leases. Others joined craft guilds, posing as business proxies for their late husbands. In Bologna, a group of 5 widows once revived a bankrupt silk operation. Using their collective assets to restart production, they called themselves the Black Loom. Their silk was darker, stronger, and cheaper than their competitors. Their biggest client, the church, that's irony, woven to perfection. You might think, weren't the men watching? Yes, some tried to intervene, but the law only stretched so far. And when you own property, paid taxes, and didn't cause open scandal, you were more nuisance than threat. Besides, most male bureaucrats didn't understand half of what the widows were doing. They saw embroidery and garden parties. They didn't see the contracts hidden in recipe books, the silver marked, with notary symbols, the loans disguised as charitable gifts. That's the real secret of 18th century widowhood. It was an education, not the kind with chalkboards or Latin verses, but the kind taught through fire. You learn how to read people, how to stall officials, how to feign helplessness just long enough to win the negotiation. A widow once wrote in her journal, "They ask if I am grieving. I say yes, but what I'm doing is accounting." And you believe her, because now you're looking at those ribbons on the breakfast table, each letter a thread in the web she spun. Some are correspondence from renters. Some are trade proposals. One, probably, is a love letter sealed with red wax, slightly frayed at the edge. She places that one aside. Not for now. Business first. Always. That's how she stays ahead. While the world debates her virtue, she's calculating interest. While suitors send poems, she's plotting vineyard expansions. While in-laws fume over the unpaid dowry, she's investing in linen mills. And when they ask how she manages it, she'll tilt her head, smile, and whisper, "I pray, and I balance my books." The sun climbs higher. Her veil is folded neatly beside her coffee cup. She wears black still, but the kind with gold threading at the sleeve. Quiet luxury, strategic mourning. As she rises, she glances once at the window, as if she knows you're watching. Maybe she does. Maybe that's part of the show, but the numbers on her ledger don't lie, and neither do her eyes. This is not a woman surviving on pity. This is a woman funding her future. One coin, one clause, one quietly overturned assumption at a time. The air is heavier now, not with incense or perfume, but with the scent of ink, parchment, and tension. You find yourself in a side room off the villa's main hall, where the table is cluttered with half-rolled scrolls, empty wine cups, and a single candle burning dangerously close to a stack of legal documents. And in the chair, arms crossed, eyes unamused, is the widow. This is not the version of her the priests write poems about. This is the version who has just spent for hours arguing over inheritance. Because here's the part no one tells you. Death is not the end of the story. It's just the opening act of the after party. And in 18th century Italy, the widow didn't just grieve her husband. She went to war for what he left behind. Welcome to the dowry after party, equal parts legal theater, family feud, and power struggle. The moment a man died, a scramble began. Who gets the land? Who keeps the furniture? Which child gets which vineyard, and where, exactly, did those sapphires go that were last seen on his mistress? The widow was expected to sit quietly through the reading of the will. But if you think she didn't come prepared, you haven't been paying attention. In many regions, the dowry a woman brought into marriage could be partially reclaimed upon her husband's death. That's the theory. In reality, this partial reclamation turned into a bureaucratic mess, especially if the widow had no male guardian or adult sons. And let's not forget the infamous second family syndrome. Those conveniently reappearing cousins, estranged half-siblings, or illegitimate children who arrived at the villa gates with pocket-sized Bibles and full-size lawsuits. Historians still argue whether this posthumous chaos was a flaw in the system or a feature. The sheer volume of disputes suggests it was baked in. After all, as long as a widow's financial stability was entangled with her in-laws' ambitions and her own family's expectations, tension was guaranteed. One widow from Verona reportedly faced 12 separate claims to her estate within the first month of her husband's funeral. One claim was from a man insisting he had been promised a pair of horses in exchange for lifetime loyalty. She responded by selling the horses and sending him a Bible. The court ruled in her favor, but not every case ended so neatly. In Florence, a widow named Isabella had her property seized temporarily by her late husband's brother, who argued that since her dowry had been spent on a failed shipping venture, she had no residual claim. She countered by presenting receipts from every purchase she'd made during the marriage, complete with annotations in the margins. This lamp, my money. This lace, gifted by Aunt Rosa. This bookshelf, I carried it home myself. Idiot. The court took 2 years to deliberate. She won, but by then, most of the wine in her cellar had mysteriously vanished. The French tidbit, she charged her in-laws for the missing bottles, full market value. And this wasn't just about things, it was about children, especially heirs. If a widow had sons, they were expected to inherit, but if they were minors, she became their legal guardian with full control over their inheritance. Cue more lawsuits, more concerned uncles, more whispered claims that she's too emotional to manage such responsibilities. Some widows lost custody of their own children's assets. Others fought tooth and nail, and occasionally won with style. In Genoa, a widow named Maria petitioned to be named her son's sole financial guardian despite a family challenge. To prove her competence, she presented an itemized budget for the next 10 years of his education, including theoretical costs of heartbreak from adolescence, priced modestly at 3 florins. The judge laughed. He signed the papers, and while all this legal brawling was happening, guess what else was? Dinner. Because family meetings didn't stop for lawsuits. You might spend your morning accusing a cousin of embezzlement, and your evening sipping lemon cordial next to him at a saint's feast. That's the duality. The knife in one hand, the olive branch in the other, and the widow had to play both roles flawlessly. Some used charm, others used proxies, lawyers, priests, even their own children, coached behind closed doors. One particularly theatrical widow in Palermo trained her eldest daughter to cry on cue. During the state hearings, the trick, pinching the inside of her arm and thinking about a dying cat. It worked. The judge was reportedly moved by the girl's sorrow and the mother's resilience. Estate secured, but not all drama played out in court. Sometimes it leaked into letters. Entire archives are filled with post-mortem correspondences, accusations scrawled in fading ink, pleas for mercy, veiled threats. One letter from 1785 reads, "If you touch the vineyard, I will tell Rome what you did in Livorno." No signature, no return address, just results, because inheritance was never just about property. It was about identity, who you were in the family tree, who got to retell the stories, reframe the legacy, reshape the past. The widow sat at the center of that storm, sometimes honored, sometimes targeted, always essential. And while some saw her as a threat, others saw her as an opportunity. Families sought her favor. Suitors circled like crows in silk jackets, and children looked to her not just for survival, but for status. After all, she wasn't just the guardian of gold. She was the keeper of names, and that power went deeper than any vault. So how did she endure it? The constant claims, the courtroom dramas, the thinly veiled bribery disguised as gifts for your grief. Simple. She documented everything. Widows kept meticulous records, transactions, conversations, promises made over wine and forgotten. By morning, they trained their servants to remember details. They hid duplicates of documents in unlikely places, inside prayer books, under floor tiles, behind false drawers. One widow in Naples reportedly kept her most valuable deeds hidden inside a hollow statue of St. Anthony. Why? Because he holds the lost. When the statue was knocked over in an earthquake, the papers spilled out. She sued her cousin for trying to burn them. She won. Again, that's the recurring theme, isn't it? winning, not because they were lucky, but because they learned. They adapted. They knew that the true cost of inheritance wasn't what you gained, it was what you had to endure to keep it. So as you sit now in that dimly lit room, watching her tie another stack of papers with a black silk ribbon, you don't see a woman drowning in grief. You see a tactician surrounded by her trophies, ledgers, letters, and legal victories, all wrapped in quiet elegance. The after-party may be messy, but she's the last one standing, drink in hand, veil slightly askew, and a ledger full of reminders that mourning doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy with interest. The doors creak open, and you step outside into the warm, vine-scented air of the courtyard, sunlight dappling through fig trees, stone steps glowing softly under the morning light, and the distant hum of harvesters calling out to one another. There she is again, already ahead of you, already in motion, walking between rows of grapes that glisten like garnets on velvet. She swapped her morning gown for something more practical. A dark linen dress, sleeves rolled, skirt lifted, just above the ankle, still veiled, yes, but with her hands wrist-deep in vines and her mind clearly elsewhere. This is no idle stroll. She's inspecting, commanding, calculating, because widowhood doesn't mean retirement. Not here. Not when there's wine to be bottled, workers to be paid, and the family name to be rebranded for a future that doesn't need a husband's signature. In 18th century Italy, especially in wine-rich regions like Tuscany, Piedmont, and parts of Sicily, the vineyard was more than a business. It was reputation in a bottle, and when the husband died, someone had to keep it running or watch it rot. In many cases, that someone was the widow. Sure, she might bring in a steward or a trusted nephew to handle the day-to-day labor, but make no mistake, the strategy, the financing, the branding, that was her. She understood the politics of barrels, the seasonal timing, the poetry of a well-named vintage. Because wine wasn't just a drink, it was a narrative, and no one knew how to sell a story quite like a widow. Historians still debate how widespread female vineyard ownership really was. Some claim it was mostly ceremonial, that women sign off on things but left the real work to men. Others point to letters, contracts, and sales records that show widows not only running estates but innovating them, shifting crops, experimenting with blends, forming export partnerships. There's evidence of widows attending trade fairs under pseudonyms, hosting secret tastings in common gardens, even slipping their product into shipments bound for papal courts. And yes, it helped that they had something the monks and merchants didn't: curiosity. A widow could ask questions without being seen as threatening. What happens if you ferment it longer? What if you blend the Sangiovese with something sweeter? What if the barrel is lined with resin instead of oak? She wasn't bound by tradition in the same way. Her position was already outside the norm, so why not experiment? One widow near Florence famously created a desert wine so potent it was banned from local weddings for causing enthusiasm beyond the bounds of decency. It sold out every year. Another in Palermo created a lighter rose that she marketed as a toast to second chances. It became popular among other widows, and the local bishop was rumored to have ordered 3 cases strictly for sacramental purposes. Of course, the French tidbit: she stamped every cork with a small carving of a phoenix, subtle but impossible to miss. Beyond the product itself, widows also mastered the art of marketing. In an era when women couldn't officially run businesses in many cities, they found ways to make their presence felt. Custom labels with poetic names, delivery notes sealed with scented wax, grape varietals named after saints, daughters, or lost seasons. One widow even included a small slip of paper in each bottle, quoting lines from Virgil. Customers kept them. Some were framed. That's what made their wine different. Not just the flavor, but the intention, and let's not pretend they did it alone. Behind many of these operations were teams of loyal staff: harvesters, coopers, cooks, drivers, many of whom stayed not for the wages, but for the woman at the helm. She'd fed them through droughts, defended them in court, baptized their children. They'd follow her into the hills or into battle. A widow with a strong vineyard wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a matriarch, and like all matriarchs, she had to navigate the constant tightrope of authority and affection. Too cold, and they'd call her cruel. Too soft, and they'd call her weak. So she did what widows always do. She balanced. She served lunch in the fields with one hand and rewrote trade agreements with the other. She scolded with a wink and negotiated with silence. And if anyone crossed her say, a jealous male neighbor who claimed she was tampering with tradition, she didn't yell. She sent a bottle of her latest vintage with a note that said, "I hope it opens your palate." He withdrew his complaint. Some called her cunning, others called her blessed. She called it Wednesday. Of course, the wine trade wasn't without its risks. Bad harvests, rising tariffs, shipping disputes. These could break even the most competent operation. But widows were used to risk. They'd already lost husbands, homes, sometimes children. A spoiled cask wasn't going to ruin them. They insured their shipments, diversified their holdings, built relationships with clergy, merchants, and distant cousins who owned cellars in Vienna or Lyon. Some even wrote letters in multiple languages, coached by Jesuit-educated sons or sympathetic monks. You're probably wondering, did they drink their own wine? Oh, yes. Not excessively. At least not most of the time, but always deliberately tasting, testing, learning. One Roman widow kept a journal of wine notes so precise that modern sommeliers still reference her flavor profiles. She described one red blend as regretful at the beginning, but generous in its ending. That's not just a wine. That's a philosophy, and occasionally, wine became more than business. It became flirtation. Hosting tastings offered the perfect excuse to invite interesting men into controlled spaces. A bishop here, a baron there, even a traveling playwright. They'd sip, they'd compliment, they'd try to probe her finances or her intentions. She'd smile, pour another round, and let them think whatever they liked. She wasn't there to marry. She was there to measure, and sometimes, just sometimes, she'd let them think they had a chance. Until the next shipment arrived. Until the next harvest needed planning. Until she remembered she preferred the quiet of the vineyard at dusk, with only the cicadas and the rustle of leaves to answer to. That's the heart of it, isn't it? The vineyard gave her more than profit. It gave her rhythm, seasons that made sense, problems with solutions, life that didn't depend on someone else's moods or permissions. It gave her the right to fail and try again, without the scrutiny of ballrooms or bishops. And maybe that's why she walks through the rows with such confidence barefoot now, the hem of her dress catching in the wind, her eyes scanning the grapes not for beauty, but for signs of readiness, of resilience, of return. She stops, picks one, tastes it, nods barely, and in that moment, you understand, she's not just the widow of a winemaker. She's the maker of something entirely her own, and every bottle that leaves her estate carries that story, one that starts with death, but ends with full glasses and futures redefined. She's writing now by lamplight, in a study that smells of lemon oil, old parchment, and maybe a hint of rose water left over from someone's bath that afternoon. The window is open just enough to let in the crickets and the muffled cough of some distant neighbor. Her pen scratches deliberately across the page, and beside her, a box of old letters lies half open, edges curling like secret smiles. The ink is black, the script elegant, the seal already warming in the wax pot. You're not supposed to see this, but you do, because this is where the real story hides, not in courtrooms or vineyards, but in correspondence, because for many 18th century Italian widows, the most powerful room in the house wasn't the drawing room or the estate office, it was the writing desk. The letters, the letters, stacks of them, folded, tied, pressed with perfume, smuggled through couriers, and cousins and kitchen boys with fast feet and looser morals. The written word was freedom, it was flirtation, it was business, diplomacy, escape. Behind the lace curtain, the inkwell became a lifeline. A well-crafted letter could secure a trade deal, renew a friendship, snub a suitor, or make a bishop blush so hard he considered rebaptizing himself. And while most women were technically discouraged from political writing, everyone knew that a widow with her husband's seal and a steady hand could pass for any man. In a dim enough room, historians still argue whether these letters were truly private or carefully constructed performances. Some point to the poetic language, the coded phrases, the triple meanings, and argue they were theatrical. Others insist they reveal deep inner lives, complex emotional landscapes, and a surprisingly modern grasp of identity. The truth, as always, is both. For some widows, letter writing was their diary. For others, it was their dagger. There's a collection in Venice's Biblioteca Marciana, containing 32 letters written by a widow named Livia to her late husband's former business partner. The early ones are formal, restrained, barely a whisper above transactional. But by letter 11, she's correcting his Latin. By letter 19, she's proposing an expansion into maritime spice trading. By letter 25, She signs simply L and includes a pressed flower. That flower, not romantic, poisonous. He never questioned her authority again. Fringe tidbit. One of those letters was stolen and published anonymously in a pamphlet about female mercantile style. It was republished in Paris under the assumption it had been written by a man. Naturally, but letters weren't just for negotiation. They were lifelines for love to some widows. Finally free from the scrutiny of husbands or fathers, rekindled old romances or started new ones under the radar. Letters allowed for privacy in a world that demanded public performance. You could say everything with ink that you'd never dare with voice. And the best part, if the letter didn't land right, you burned it. No scandal, no witnesses, just a curl of smoke and a story saved from misstep. Many widows adopted codes, simple ones at first. A mention of rain meant danger, a reference to fake men affection. Over time, these turned elaborate. In one case from Bologna, a widow and her secret lover wrote entire conversations, using only the titles of religious texts. Consolation, of the soul men I miss you, lives of the desert saints men I saw you with her, explain. She even created a filing system in her bookshelf to track the timeline. Genius, really. And occasionally, these affairs weren't entirely secret. Some were tolerated, even admired, especially if the man was of lower rank and the widow remained technically unattached. It was romantic, even thrilling. An older woman with power, a younger man with poetry, letters passed by candlelight, meetings at borrowed cloisters. It sounds fictional until you realize it happened often enough to be referenced in etiquette manuals, usually under chapters titled Discretion and Widowly Dignity. The church, predictably, frowned, but without proof, there wasn't much they could do, and many clerics were too busy writing letters of their own. The lines between scandal and strategy were thin, often written in cursive. Still, for every flirtatious note, there were 10 more about family, finances, or personal grief. Widows wrote to sisters, to distant cousins, to childhood friends now locked in convents or exiled to the countryside. They wrote to lawyers, to poets. Sometimes they wrote to no one at all, letters addressed to their dead husbands, tucked into drawers or behind altar cloths. Historians have found them stained with wine, soot, and occasionally tears. One widow in Pisa wrote to her husband every month for 4 years. The letters start formal, shift to bitter, then humorous, then affectionate again. The final letter reads simply, I am ready now to forgive both of us. That's the intimacy of ink. And don't underestimate how much could be risked through a single letter. One misstep and intercepted confession, an indiscreet servant, a wrongly folded page, and your entire fortune could teeter. That's why widows develop layers of subtext. Words that said one thing and meant another. I trust the crop will bloom early this year could mean you may approach at dusk. My cousin's health declines could mean do not come. Danger. This was espionage by invitation. Whole romantic arcs unfolded through this paper ballet, and sometimes the letters weren't between lovers, but between allies. Widows banded together, writing in support of each other's legal claims, businesses, or social ventures. They shared tips on estate law, on avoiding taxes, on keeping suitors confused, and clergy content. One letter from a widow in Palermo ends with a recipe for almond cake and a note. Serve this to him while declining his offer. Sweetness softens the blow. Another widow copied that letter and mailed it to 5 others. A network was forming of ink, of resistance, of mutual admiration. It wasn't called feminism. It didn't need a name. It was survival, decorated. And sometimes, just sometimes, a widow wrote a letter for no strategic reason. No love, no land, no lawsuits. Just because the night was quiet and the candle was steady, and the words felt like company, a way to speak without being spoken to, a way to feel seen by the ink itself. There's something beautiful in that, a kind of sleepwalking honesty. Words written by lamplight that no daylight would judge. So as you stand behind her now, watching her sign her name, nothing more than an initial, a swirl, a seal, you understand the power she's holding, not the pen, the possibility. And as the wax cools and she places the letter into a small satchel bound for the port, you know that something has just changed. Somewhere, someone will read her words and feel them like a thread tightening. And in a world that constantly tried to silence her, the thread was everything. Because silence may be safe, but ink leaves evidence. Ink dares. Ink whispers long after the room has gone still. It's nearing twilight, and now you're in the nursery, a room you didn't expect to find. tucked between the stone staircases and filled with the ghostly residue of lullabies and dried lavender. The shutters are cracked just enough to catch the last of the sun's golden fingers stretching across the floor, highlighting toys that haven't been touched in months and a cradle that creaks gently. With no child in sight, she's sitting there, of course, not in her veils tonight, but in something softer. Well, perhaps pale gray, her hair pulled back, her hands folded, and in her lap, a letter from her eldest, or maybe it's a report from the tutor, or a drawing, smudged with the fingerprints of a 6-year-old who doesn't yet know how heavy the world can be, because for all the strategic posturing, financial maneuvering, and silk-lined vengeance, the Italian widow was, more often than not, also a mother. And motherhood after death, that's a battlefield of its own, raising children. As a widow in 18th century Italy was part nurturing, part negotiation, and part psychological warfare, because everyone, and I mean everyone, had an opinion about what should happen to your children once your husband was gone. His family wanted the heirs. Your family wanted the dowry back. The church wanted them properly catechized. The state wanted them tall enough to conscript. And you just wanted them safe, healthy, educated, not stolen in the night by some great uncle with a fragile ego and 3 unpaid debts. But good luck with that. The moment your husband died, the vultures circled. Noble families saw your sons as chess pieces and your daughters as dowry dispensers. The church offered to take in your girls for spiritual care, which meant to quietly remove them from inheritance complications. And if your children were very young, there was always a cousin who conveniently remembered being promised guardianship after the 3rd glass of limoncello at a wedding 15 years ago. Historians still debate whether widowed mothers had genuine authority over their children, or were merely tolerated as placeholders. The legal documents vary wildly. Some name mothers as full guardians, others make them co-guardians with male relatives. Some include bizarre stipulations like, she may educate the girls, but not select their music instructor. But one thing is consistent. The emotional labor was hers, the sleepless nights, the whispered prayers, the practical decisions cloaked in softness how to talk about death when your youngest still asked if Papa was away on a trip. And when that child cried, you didn't cry back. You just rocked them harder, staring into the fire, wondering how to stretch bread through another week without selling off the silver. For wealthier widows, the challenges shifted but didn't vanish. Tutors had to be vetted. Sons needed connections to guilds or clergy or the military. Daughters required wardrobes, dowries, dance lessons, and the delicate skill of knowing how to say no without sounding defiant. Because God forbid your girl be both rich and opinionated. She might never marry, and marriage, after all, was the exit strategy society expected. One Roman widow reportedly spent 2 years interviewing music instructors, firing anyone who made her daughters blush. Not out of prudishness, out of fear. Reputation was currency, and her daughters were the vault. If even one looked too eager, too flirtatious, too well-read, it could ruin a decade of careful planning. Some widows did remarry, but not always. For romance, sometimes it was to secure a stronger future for their children. A second husband might bring legitimacy, connections, or simply more hands to manage an estate teetering under pressure. But every widow knew the risk. A new husband meant a new hierarchy. Your children, once the center, might now become obstacles. There's a chilling letter in an 18th century archive from a widow in Siena to her sister. He says, he loves me, but he scowls when Paolo speaks. If he strikes my son, I will poison his soup with my silence. The marriage ended. The widow sold her wedding ring to fund a tutor for Paolo, the French tidbit. Paolo grew up to become a city magistrate and never married. Rumors said he kept a lock of his mother's hair in his coat, and the daughters, protecting them was a full-time job. If a son was seen as an heir, a daughter was a liability in lace. She needed a dowry, a good match, and ideally, no scandal. Before her name was embroidered on a wedding pillow, some widows poured their souls into grooming their daughters for success, languages, calligraphy, modesty, and just enough flirtation to suggest charm. Without desperation, others, especially those with fewer resources, leaned on common schools not for religious vocation, but for safety. It wasn't uncommon for a widow to rotate her daughters between relatives, each one responsible for a different part of the social puzzle. One aunt for sewing, one cousin for elocution, one grandmother for humility training, also known as passive-aggressive storytelling, and always The pressure loomed, because every delay in marriage cost more, and every suitor rejected meant another round of lease repairs and feigned enthusiasm. But here's where it gets complicated. Not all widows push for marriage. Some raise their daughters to run shops, manage estates, write letters. One widow in Genoa trained her daughters in bookkeeping and real estate negotiation. She called them her lace-gloved lions. When asked why she didn't marry them off, she replied, "I prefer them busy and breathing." That family line prospered for generations. And don't assume widowhood meant total isolation from joy. Children brought moments of light that courtships and lawsuits never could. A toddler's giggle, a teenage son quoting Virgil at dinner, a daughter smuggling home candied chestnuts from a market stall. These were victories, too. Quiet ones, but lasting. In one preserved diary, a widow writes, "They slept through the thunder tonight. I did not, but their breathing reminded me what I fight for." That sentence has been copied into a dozen history books. Most get the punctuation wrong. All miss the point, because it's not about punctuation. It's about presence. The widow wasn't just surviving for herself. She was fighting for memory, for continuity, for the right to raise her children without interference, to tell her husband's story the way she remembered it, not the way the church or the cousins or the taxman insisted it be told. And when her children grew up, they remembered. They wrote letters praising her resilience. They defended her name in court. One even built a fountain in her honor, shaped like a lioness guarding her cubs. It's still there. The water runs cold. So now, as she folds the child's drawing, tucks it into the family Bible, and blows out the lamp, you see something rare. Not a strategist or a businesswoman or a flirt, just a mother, bone-tired, soft-eyed, staring into the middle distance with that look only widows and wolves share, the look that says, "I will fight until there's nothing left, but my children standing in the light I carved for them, and then, maybe, I'll rest." The market is noisy this morning, bakers shouting prices, dogs yapping at wheelbarrows, and somewhere, a violinist stubbornly playing the same half-tune he's been playing for the last 3 days. You follow her through it all, the widow, cloaked, again in black, gliding past the fishmongers and fig sellers like a ghost who has paid rent to stay among them. Living. She's not shopping. She's performing. Every step, every glance, every slow turn of her head is deliberate, calculated, and you finally understand. This isn't a market. It's a stage, and she's here for the role of her life, because in 18th century Italy, grief wasn't just a feeling, it was branding. A widow didn't just wear black because she was sad. She wore it because it was armor, currency, and sometimes bait. Public mourning was an art form, and those who mastered it could move through society like shadows with teeth. Historians still argue whether public grief was a sincere emotional outlet or a social performance. In truth, it was both. A woman could feel her heart breaking and still know exactly how many tears to shed during Mass, before stepping outside and adjusting her veil just so revealing the edge of her cheekbone, for maximum effect, because eyes were always watching. Neighbors, suitors, rivals, priests, and most of all, the city's rumor mill, which ground faster than any flour wheel. A well-timed sigh, a graceful refusal to dance, even the pace at which she walked through the square, every detail added to the mythology. The black veil wasn't hiding her face, it was focusing it, like a spotlight. There was a rule, unspoken, but known. Mourned a little, and you were cold. Mourned too much, and you were manipulating. But mourned just right. You became something untouchable, sacred, sensual, both respected and just out of reach. The French tidbit. In some regions like Venice and Naples, there were literal mourning consultants, older widows who would coach newly bereaved women on how to dress, how to move, what to say. They charged in silver. One even published a pamphlet titled Sorrow, styled. It sold out twice, and it wasn't just about clothes. It was about face. Not the literal one, though, that mattered, but reputation. A widow who cried beautifully was considered tasteful. A widow who wept uncontrollably at the bakery was whispered about for weeks. Some women practiced in mirrors, practiced trembling. Hands practiced the tilt of the head that said, "I'm fine," and meant, "I remember." The performance extended to the house. Mourning wreaths on doors, covered mirrors, closed shutters. Musicians refused entry, candles lit at dusk. Even the way servants greeted guests could signal the depth of the widow's grief. Some employed actors' cousins who hadn't spoken to the dead husband in years, suddenly appearing to sob theatrically at doorsteps, making sure the entire neighborhood saw their devotion. And when guests came to pay respects, the widow hosted like a queen in exile. Tea served in silence, short phrases of gratitude, a well-timed glance out the window, as though the world had lost its color. She was the main character, and the house was her novel. But here's where it gets slippery. Sometimes she liked the performance too much, not because she didn't grieve, but because she had never been so visible before. As a wife, she was a supporting role. As a widow, she was the plot, and that attention, it changed things, gave her options, made her consider what else might be possible if she played the role just a little longer. Some prolonged mourning on purpose, delayed the return to color, declined invitations with poetic excuses. One widow in Milan wore black for 13 years. When asked why, she said, "Because no other color understands me." People started quoting her. It ended up embroidered on handkerchiefs. Sales boomed. Others used grief as a way to reset, to disappear from previous scandals, to rebrand after an unfortunate marriage. Widowhood allowed for reinvention. You could move cities, change your hair, adopt a new tone of voice. No one questioned a woman in mourning. They just stepped aside. That space, that was priceless, and some monetized it directly, selling funeral cakes, renting mourning garb to poorer widows, writing elegies under pseudonyms and selling them to desperate young wives for the florins a verse. One particularly enterprising woman opened a shop selling hand-dyed black veils, each named after a different stage of grief: whisper, storm, hollow. They sold out by feast day. She claimed her lace was prayed over. It wasn't, but her margins were divine. Of course, not everyone approved. Clergy warned against performative grief, fearing it detracted from genuine spiritual reflection. One bishop famously gave a sermon titled, "Woe to the widow who dances behind the altar." He meant it metaphorically, but the widow in question, a certain Lady Teresa, responded by hosting a dinner dance in her garden complete with live music and mourning-themed place cards. The invite said, "We dine in sorrow, but we waltz in memory." 50 guests attended, including the priests, and yet, despite the performances, despite the velvet and the sighs and the slow, poetic walks through moonlit courtyards, the grief was often real, just hidden, distilled, controlled. Because the truth was, grief in public had rules. Real sobbing was for the bedroom, for the servant who found her crumpled in her dead husband's shirt, for the pillow that absorbed every scream she swallowed at breakfast. But outside, she mourned like marble, and that duality, it exhausted her. One diary entry reads, "They say I grieve with grace, but what they call grace is restraint, and what they call restraint is a leash." She wore it anyway, because it got her through, because it kept her safe, because sometimes it even made her powerful. And that's the catch, in a world where women were supposed to be invisible. Widowhood made them visible, but only if they dressed the part, cried the part, played the part. You might ask, wasn't it all fake? But that's the wrong question. The better one is, how else could she survive? How else could she turn something as brutal as loss into something that bought her time, choice, even admiration? The performance wasn't dishonesty. It was protection. It was translation. It was a way of saying, "Don't touch me yet, I am not done writing the next chapter." And so you follow her again, past the olive stalls and the cheese carts, where vendors pause and nod with just enough reverence to say, "We remember." She doesn't smile. She nods back. She doesn't need to say anything. Her veil says it all. And beneath that veil, not just grief, not just calculation, but a woman who has learned that branding isn't about lies. It's about control, about crafting the version of you that others will dare not question. And in a city full of chatter, she walks quietly, but every footstep echoes like a bell, low, final, and just loud enough to remind you, the widow doesn't beg for space. She claims it, one black lace breath at a time. You're not sure how you ended up here back in the dining hall, long after dinner has passed, with nothing on the table but half-melted wax and the quiet hiss of spent firewood. She's still here too, seated at the head of the long, polished table, where once her husband reigned like a minor king, and now she presides with far fewer words and far more results. The plates are gone, the wine decanted, but what lingers is heavier than meat or drink. You feel it in the air, authority. Because while everyone talks about the fathers, the generals, the dukes, the real backbone of Italian family power in the 18th century, was not always dressed in gold braid. Sometimes it was wrapped in widow's black and quietly recalibrating the entire household from the same chair where her husband once shouted orders. Welcome to the era of the matriarch. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Patriarchy ruled on paper. Titles passed through sons, decisions made by councils of men, property regulated by male-centered laws. But step inside the villa of a widow, especially one who'd buried her husband and outlived her brothers, and the reality unfolded differently. Behind the marble busts and oil portraits of solemn ancestors was often a woman keeping the ledgers, deciding the marriages, negotiating with tenants and instructing the staff, not always publicly, not always directly, but decisively. Historians still argue how widespread this quiet role really was. Some suggest that widows merely filled in until sons matured. Others believe they were foundational both economically and socially, especially in urban centers where property consolidation and political alliances were built on bloodlines, not votes. What's clear is this: when the husband died, the widow didn't disappear, she recalibrated. If there were sons, she guided them. If there were daughters, she trained them. If there were uncles sniffing around the wine cellar, hoping for weakness, she outlasted them. Some even used the myth of female fragility to their advantage. A widow who cried in public could command sympathy, delay negotiations, or distract competitors while quietly building an information network through servants, confessors, and cousins' wives. French tidbit: in 1789, a widow in Florence managed to redirect an entire wine shipment through an alternate trade route by faking a fainting spell. In front of the magistrate's assistant, buying just enough time to reroute her cargo and outbid her rivals. She later sent the assistant a fruit basket and a thank you note. This is where the question of masculinity begins to unravel. Italian society prided itself on virile men warriors, poets, merchants with booming voices and mustaches as thick as oak roots. But many of those men couldn't hold a household together if their lives depended on it. They could duel, sure, but budget a vineyard harvest, negotiate with 3 rival relatives about property borders, coordinate a saint's feast without offending half the village. Not so much. Widows did all of it, and they did it while wearing black and pretending not to notice. How many people were afraid of them? They weren't tyrants. Most didn't need to be. Their authority came not from shouting, but from memory. Everyone remembered how they held the household together after the plague, how they stepped in when a steward stole from the kitchen, how they nursed a husband through his final illness without complaint. That kind of competence doesn't need volume. It needs a chair, a candle, and silence. That silence carried weight. A widow could walk into a room and end an argument just by raising an eyebrow, could cancel a suitor's ambitions by adjusting her seating chart, could reroute a whole branch of the family tree. With one approving nod toward a niece's future husband, the family might say, "We consulted her," but what they meant was, "We knew better than to act without her." That's the part no one wanted to say aloud. The men feared it would emasculate them. The women feared it would make them targets, so the myth of the passive widow persisted, even as reality broke it into little pieces at every supper table. And yet, for all this power, the role was lonely, authority isolated, respect rarely brought warmth. Friends disappeared when mourning dragged on too long. Male allies became suspicious if she didn't remarry. Female companions could become jealous. Children grew, married, left. And the widow, she stayed in the villa, managing her domain like a captain at sea, too capable to sink, too respected to dock, too guarded to truly exhale. Some cracked under the pressure. One diary describes a widow who burned all her household records during a fit of exhaustion. She said she wanted to watch the paper suffer for once. Her estate survived. She did not. Others thrived. They built schools, donated to hospitals, became patrons of poets, composers, painters. Their names didn't end up in textbooks, but they appear in dedications and chapel plaques, in the margins of old music sheets. To the noble lady who gave me bread and a reason. The duality persisted. They were matriarchs, but not always mothers, rulers, but not sovereigns, feared, but also needed, and some of them reveled in it. One widow in Lucca turned her household into a matriarchal stronghold, banning men from all staff positions above the age of 12. Her steward was a girl who dressed as a boy in town and signed letters as Giovanni. Her wine shipments were handled by her granddaughter. Her legal counsel, a nun with a law degree. When asked why she didn't trust men, she replied, "I Trusted one. I buried him. That was plenty. This wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. And in her clarity, she created something rare, a household that ran not on fear, but on competence. There was laughter there, stories, songs at dusk, and no one needed to raise their voice, because everyone already knew who made the decisions, even if no one said it aloud. And so you sit with her now, in the long, echoing hall, where the ghosts of past dinners hover like smoke and the silence is heavy with memory. She's not giving orders, she's listening, watching, calculating. The candle flickers. A breeze catches the corner of the tablecloth. Somewhere in the back of the house, a maid hums a lullaby, and in the flickering light, you see it, not just strength, but legacy, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't need to, the kind that endures because it has already outlived every man who underestimated it. You've left the quiet of the villa now, following the faint sound of conversation and the low thud of footsteps on stone. The street winds tighter, the air sharper, and suddenly you're not alone. Black silhouettes move ahead of you, not one, not two, but 5, maybe 6. Their veils are pinned back just enough to reveal strong jawlines, glinting earrings, eyes that don't blink. They walk in unison, their voices low, clipped, purposeful. These aren't sisters on a pilgrimage or widows off to confession. These are women with errands, legal errands, possibly revenge, possibly both, because what you're watching in real time is something that even seasoned magistrates dreaded seeing turn up outside their offices. A widow gang. Yes, you heard that right. In 18th century Italy, certain widows didn't just mourn. They organized. They banded together. They became something between an economic alliance and a soft form of street justice. An informal consortium of grief-hardened women who had lost patience with bureaucracy and found strength in numbers. Historians have different names for them: support networks, household collectives, civic prayer leagues, but let's call them what they really were: strategic, tactical, lace-draped syndicates with zero patience for nonsense, some formed out of necessity. A cluster of widows from the same neighborhood pooled resources to pay lawyers, share laborers, or rotate child care. Others formed out of vengeance: women who lost property, were denied inheritance, or had children taken into forced guardianship. Alone, their voices were dismissible. Together, they were impossible to ignore. And when they showed up at your court hearing, sitting in the front row in identical veils, you knew something was about to be uncomfortably efficient. There's a record from Padua in 1764 of a group known locally as Lisette Ombra, the Seven Shadows. They weren't secret. They just didn't talk much. Each was a widow with a grievance, property seized by in-laws, a son denied apprenticeship, a daughter slandered. They didn't brandish weapons. They wore gloves. They didn't scream. They showed up in groups, in silence, and after several appearances outside the city clerk's office. The clerk retired. One of the Ombra later became a property broker. Another funded a girls' school. The rest, quietly powerful, perpetually underestimated. The French tidbit. A local baker claimed he baked them special loaves free of charge to keep their judgment from falling on my needing hands. The phenomenon wasn't isolated. In Naples, there were records of widows co-owning rental properties. Legal loopholes allowed them to combine assets more freely than married women. They created their own lending networks, offering loans to trusted parties with interest rates better than local banks. Some formed rotating savings groups that met monthly under the guise of rosary meetings. If you couldn't pay, they didn't call the bailiff. They sent tea and a suggestion, repaid by cleaning the widow cooperative's chapel or helping at market. Mutual aid with a touch of velvet steel, but it wasn't all benevolence. Some groups used their influence to pressure judges, freeze out rivals, or control pricing in local markets. They never signed anything. They didn't need to. A stern nod from 3 veiled figures at a council meeting often said, more than a stack of petitions. And while men mocked them in taverns, called them the grieving guild or the lace mafia, those same men often married their daughters into those networks for protection, for access, for peace. In Venice, one widow coalition famously sued a guild for denying their sons entry when the guild resisted. The widows responded not with more legal threats, but with something far more effective: a boycott. They stopped buying from the guild's artisans. They redirected commissions to rivals. They lobbied church patrons to change suppliers. Within a year, 3 guild leaders had resigned, and the doors were open again. This wasn't random vengeance. It was coordinated, intelligent. and deeply personal. It was about rewriting the rules of a game that had never been meant for them, and they didn't always act through institutions. Sometimes their theater was social. A widow might host a party and invite only the wives of magistrates. Another might stage an impromptu public mourning just outside the house of a political rival. Loud weeping, black candles, a priest who just happened to be available. The target couldn't call the guards, it would look cruel. Couldn't ignore it, it would look suspicious. The best he could do, issue a public apology for whatever, a fetch he hadn't actually named. That's how these groups operated, not just with strength, but with plausible deniability. They weren't gangs in the violent sense, but they knew how to use fear and performance and memory, and the collective power of women no longer interested in waiting politely for justice. Of course, not every widow participated. Many preferred solitude, others distrusted collective action, some feared backlash. But those who joined found something precious: protection, companionship, leverage, and laughter, yes, even laughter. One surviving letter from a Florentine widow describes a Thursday meeting where the women debated property taxes over biscuits and ended the afternoon by betting on which neighbor would be accused of adultery next. The prize, a bottle of almond liqueur and bragging rights for a week. Power, after all, doesn't mean you can't have tea and gossip. It just means your tea is better and your gossip has impact. You're probably wondering, did anyone ever try to stop them? Of course. Some local officials cracked down, issued edicts about improper gathering or female interference in civil matters. But enforcement was tricky. These weren't mobs in the street. These were respected women in their own homes, in church pews, at market stalls. They were invisible until they weren't. And when they were unforgettable. Eventually, even some clergy acknowledged the inevitability of these groups. One bishop, tired of dealing with collective widow petitioning, offered to host monthly grievance meetings at the parish hall. He served biscuits. Attendance doubled. The minute someone tries to institutionalize your rebellion, you know you're winning. So now you walk behind them, these women in black. As they vanish around a corner toward the notary's office, you don't hear their footsteps. You don't hear them speak, but you feel the change in the air. The way even the dogs step back, the way shutters don't creak is loud. You're witnessing history that never made the textbooks. Not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't loud in the ways history likes. It was a different kind of revolution, soft-footed, sharp-tongued, coordinated over coffee and grief, and as they disappear into the dusk, you realize something chilling and beautiful. No one ever told them they had permission. They just started acting like they did, and the world, slowly, began to obey. The corridor is quiet again, but not empty. She's seated near the window this time, the one that overlooks the east garden, where the ivy clings like secrets and the orange trees sway in that slow, suggestive way that makes you think they know something. Her gloves are off, folded neatly beside a leather-bound volume of Petrarch. Though the pages haven't moved for a while, her tea is untouched. There's a letter in her hand creased, Ray read, probably memorized. From whom? You don't know, but you can guess, because there's a silence here too precise to be grief. It's the quiet of preparation. She's not mourning. She's considering. And if there's one thing a widow learns faster than her new legal status, it's how to say no. Not the loud kind, not the slap a suitor kind, the soft rejection, the gentle decline, the art of saying, this tea is delicious, when what you mean is, never speak to me again unless you arrive with a dowry and a title polished clean of scandal. In 18th century Italy, widows occupied a strange, shimmering space between desire and disdain. Everyone wanted their attention: sons, priests, rivals, landlords, but few knew how to handle their boundaries. That's where the soft rejection came in, the kind that preserved dignity, diffused tension, and left just enough ambiguity to be repeated at dinner parties for years. Saying no wasn't just survival, it was performance, and the best actresses did it with flair. A turn of the wrist, a compliment to your mother, a gift returned unopened, but with a fresh lemon tied to the ribbon, because everyone knew a lemon meant no, thank you, but you're sweet. A sour cherry? That meant try again, and I'll embarrass you in front of the bishop. Historians still debate whether these gestures were codified or improvised. Some say there were handbooks, little etiquette guides passed between noblewomen that laid out a system of floral rejections and tonal warnings. Others believe these customs were regional, shaped by local jokes, market metaphors, and seasonal fruit. But whatever the origin, they worked. A widow could freeze an entire courtship with a single sentence like, "Your handwriting reminds me of my late husband's tragically uneven." That's cold, but it's polite. And polite was everything, because open rejection was dangerous. Say no too firmly, and a spurned suitor might retaliate with lawsuits, rumors, even violence. But say no with wit, with elegance. That disarmed them, gave them an exit. Let them tell themselves they chose to withdraw. And widows learned this early, especially the wealthy ones, whose fortunes turned them into targets. They were courted not with love, but with desperation. Poems, pastries, even public declarations, some sincere, many transparent. One widow in Naples was serenaded every morning for a month by a young man claiming to be descended from Virgil. She eventually sent him a scroll of actual Virgilian verse, annotated and read with her edits. He never returned. The French tidbit? That annotated scroll was later found in a Jesuit library, cataloged under female corrections. Alarming, but not all rejections were literary. Some were logistical. A widow might invite a suitor to dine, then seat him next to the oldest, gassiest aunt in the household. Others set their dogs to bark whenever a particular admirer approached. One particularly blunt woman in Siena pretended to have taken a vow of silence. Whenever her least favorite baron arrived, she would mime, nod, and communicate through a servant with bad breath. He proposed anyway. She accidentally spilled ink on the proposal. Twice. It wasn't just men they had to reject. Families interfered. Mothers suggested matches. Brothers negotiated dowries. Priests hinted that remarriage would stabilize the soul. And through it all, the widow nodded, smiled, postponed, after the harvest. Once morning ends, when the stars are less angry, the trick wasn't to say no once. The trick was to say it 50 times in 50 different languages without ever using the word. And that kind of emotional choreography, that takes stamina, which is why many widows practiced in private rehearsing phrases, drafting responses, consulting old letters. Saying no became a kind of spiritual hygiene, a way to maintain autonomy without provoking retribution, because a woman who refused to openly could find herself slandered, shunned, even sabotaged, her property contested, her children disinherited, her name dragged through the street by whispers with clean hands. But a woman who declined artfully, she was admired, quoted, imitated. You can find their phrases in marginalia, scribbled in cookbooks, etched into dressing tables. One mirror in a Venetian estate has carved along its base, say it sweet, but say it final. That's centuries-old advice, still good, of course. Not every rejection was social. Some were economic. Widows declined offers to sell property, to merge estates, to fund untrustworthy ventures. One woman in Bologna declined a risky investment by sending a bottle of oil labeled for slippery slopes. It was returned unopened. She invested in a bakery instead, doubled her profits. Her family later used olive oil as shorthand for any bad idea. That sounds oily, they say, and if the suitor pushed, if he appeared uninvited, if he brought wine instead of wit, that's when the widow called in the staff, not to remove him, to outcharm him. The cook who quoted Cicero, the maid who claimed to be engaged to 3 different merchants, the steward who recited legal clauses while polishing silver. By the end of the evening, the suitor had either forgotten why he came or decided it wasn't worth the effort. Some widows took it further. They hosted salons filled with men they had no intention of marrying, laughed just enough to keep them hopeful, introduced them to one another, watched the chaos bloom. One wrote in her journal, 3 men fought over my hand this week. I gave them all my glove instead and told them to try it on. None fit. How? Tragic. That's not arrogance. That's strategy. That's knowing that in a world where saying yes too soon could trap you forever, learning to say no with style was its own kind of liberation. So now you watch her rise, letter still in hand, and move toward the fireplace. She doesn't rip the paper. She folds it, places it on the mantel. Above it, a portrait of her late husband looks on, more curious than stern. She doesn't glance at it. She doesn't need to. The portrait doesn't intimidate her. Nothing does anymore, because she's not afraid to decline, and she doesn't need to raise her voice to do it. She simply exists unapologetically, decisively, elegantly uninterested. The fire crackles once. The garden breathes outside. Somewhere, another letter waits to be answered. Maybe she'll write back. Maybe she won't. That's the power of a widow who knows exactly what she will not allow. The room is dark, but warm. lit by the amber glow of three mismatched candelabras that lean slightly like tired sentinels. There's music floating in from somewhere distant, a viola, or maybe a badly tuned lute, but it's not enough to distract from what's happening in front of you. She's laughing, not the polite chuckle of a salon hostess or the restrained giggle of a woman watching someone else's child trip in church. This is real, deep, joyful, and pointed, because sitting across from her, with his hat nervously twisted, in his lap and his waistcoat slightly too tight, is a man half her age, maybe a little less, and she's absolutely thriving. Welcome to the not-so-secret world of May-December romances in 18th century Italy, where the phrase "you're old enough to be his mother" was more likely to draw raised eyebrows of admiration than shock, because for certain widows, especially wealthy, childless, or simply tired of being underestimated, the idea of marrying or just entertaining a much younger man wasn't scandalous. It was strategic and occasionally delightful. Society, of course, pretended to frown. Catholic morality and patriarchal norms wagged their collective fingers, but behind closed doors, it was far more common than the official records admit. Historians still argue whether these relationships were about love, lust, loneliness, or leverage. Probably all four. What's undeniable is that they existed and often flourished in the carefully drawn margins of respectability. Let's be clear, these weren't predatory arrangements. The widow wasn't chasing some helpless lamb into her boudoir. These younger men were often eager, hungry for patronage, mentorship, housing, or simply a woman who knew her own mind and didn't cry when someone called her intimidating. Some were poets, some were painters, some were disgraced clergymen with nowhere to go but into the arms of someone who already had her own estate and wasn't interested in a wedding ceremony, unless it came with better seating options. One such pairing from Bologna involved a widow in her mid-40s and a 20-year-old failed opera singer. She gave him room, board, and time to rehearse. He gave her company, comic relief, and exactly 3 decent arias before disappearing with the traveling troupe. Her journal entry reads, "He was useless in winter, but lovely on balconies." French tidbit. Her niece later married a real baritone. Apparently, standards evolved. These arrangements came with benefits. The widow got companionship without the power struggle. The young man got experience, status by association, and a soft place to land. And because the widow controlled the household, there was no mother-in-law drama, no awkward dowry negotiations, no pressure to produce heirs. It was a reprieve from the expectations that usually smothered romantic entanglements. And sometimes it was more than reprieve, it was redemption. A second act for a woman who had spent her first being managed, judged, or politely ignored. With a younger lover, she didn't have to perform obedience. She got to perform delight. And make no mistake, she was in control. These relationships rarely ended in marriage. Some evolved into lifelong partnerships. Others burned out quickly and quietly. A few turned bitter, usually when the boy thought himself the hero of the story and the widow reminded him whose house he was eating in. But most ended with dignity, a letter, a necklace returned, a final dinner with extra wine, and a kiss in the hallway. That was the unspoken contract, joy without captivity, of course. Not everyone handled it so elegantly. One Florentine widow was accused by her priest of harboring youthful distractions. Her response, she invited the priest to dinner, seated him between 2 of her former lovers, and served nothing but oyster stew. He left after the second bowl. She paid his church tithe the next morning, with interest. It wasn't just about rebellion, it was about rewriting the power dynamic. In a world where older men routinely married teenage girls and called it tradition, widows flipping the script wasn't scandal, it was symmetry, and society adapted faster than you'd think. Fashion magazines printed veiled references to youthful companions. Etiquette books began advising young men on courting women of maturity. Even the theater caught on comedies about charming older widows, and their foolish suitors became popular. One play titled Asters, The Lady's Garden, has new blossoms. Asters ran for 7 seasons in Genoa. The main character? A widow named Isadora, who collected young admirers like roses and tossed them out. When they wilted, she always exited stage right, tossing a fan over her shoulder. You can still find broadsides with her famous line, "If he cannot keep rhythm, I shall clap alone." And it wasn't all about sex or performance. Sometimes, these relationships were deeply intellectual. A widow with years of reading, estate, management, and courtroom strategy found in her younger lover someone who still asked questions, who challenged her gently, who admired her mind as much as her silhouette. She could quote Cicero without being corrected. She could speak plainly about her past without softening it for someone's ego. One widow wrote, "He listens when I speak of battlefields and rice shortages. He does not try to fix me. He just brings more ink." That line is carved on her tombstone. No husband ever got a mention. Naturally, this dynamic was easier for the wealthy. A poor widow might find companionship, but scandal could destroy her reputation. But even then, stories trickled out. A washerwoman in Naples who took in a young cobbler, a midwife in Lucca who kept her apprentice long after he'd earned his papers. These weren't just romances, they were alliances, agreements between survivors. And while they may not have ended in marriage or estate transfer, they offered something harder to quantify: presence. Someone to laugh with overburnt bread, someone to fetch books from the top shelf, someone to touch your shoulder without asking if your mourning period was over. That meant something. So now, as you sit quietly and watch her pour wine for her young guest who fumbles slightly with the glass and tries to compliment her earrings, you realize something profound. She isn't trying to reclaim her youth. She's enjoying her power, her ease, her freedom from the oppressive machinery of age and gender roles. She doesn't need him. She wants him, and that difference is everything. There's no desperation here, no illusions, just a people sharing a table under candlelight, aware that tomorrow he might leave and she'll remain. She'll return to her letters, her land, her silence, and she'll be just fine. Because once you've mastered the art of loss, pleasure becomes sacred. And a widow who chooses joy on her own terms, that's not scandal. That's sovereignty with a side of flirtation. You step into the evening air once more, drawn toward the chapel courtyard where dust settles like velvet on statues of Saint Soft. Silent, eternal. She's there, once again, but this time with purpose, not for a funeral, not for ceremony, but for something even more final. Tonight is her planned exit, the heredity, the control. The dozen suits trimmed to follow her until the veil dropped. None of it matters now. You see her arranging candles on the steps, each one flickering with calculated softness, transforming gray stone into a stage for closure. Because a widow's final flex was the funeral of her own legacy, a public opera, a theatrical coda, a closing statement built for both mourning and myth-making dot in 18th century Italy. Funerals were really just about death. They were about message. But some widows flipped the script, turning their own future memorial into a piece of theater meant to shape their memory forever. Scholars still debate whether this practice was vanity or something more akin to political branding. But late in life, after surviving lawsuits, suitors, estates, children, church scorn, and the constant glare of society, a widow who organized a finale to her own story wasn't vain. She was in control of her final act. She bypassed gossip. She dictated the optics. She claimed the narrative. These performances were rich. One such widow in Verona designed her own funeral chamber months before death. Ebony draped catafalque, embroidered pall embroidered with vines, and grapes symbolizing rebirth. Musicians trained to play a dirge that ended in soft major chords. She included music sheets with margin notes. Play louder when the bearers pause. Let everyone think they hear death at their feet. The fringe detail. When she died, the priest reportedly found her ledger open beside the casket. The final entry, to whom it may concern. I wore black better than anyone. It's impossible to know if it's legend, but it became legend. Embroidered onto mourning fans and whispered at wakes. Why make performance the finale? Because a widow had spent a lifetime fighting invisibility. This was the last chance to be remembered by design, not by accident. To exit on her terms, with control instead of chaos, and like every good script, it had act breaks. One widow held. A final family gathering the week before, reading letters she'd written but never sent confessions. Apologies, revelations, some men wept, some brides blanched. The official funeral days later felt like the final bow, but when the music stopped and the crowd dispersed, she had already rewritten expectations. But the performance wasn't just for family. It was for posterity, the next-gen children, nieces. Nieces watched how she orchestrated her last stand. They learned that agency shouldn't flicker out with illness, age, or death. They saw that a woman who had once lost everything could still shape history with her departure. That's legacy. Not every widow went this route. Some preferred quiet pauses, unmarked graves, private headstones. but those who did became myths. Their funerals were riddled in salons, their tombs visited by curious pilgrims, their epigraphs quoted in etiquette guides. She performed well. The dream of invisibility, of slipping into rest, became a final refusal of oblivion. Tonight, as the final candle wavers in the night breeze and the last note fades, you sense it. This is closing scene, curtain call. The crowd retreats. The musicians mount their carts. The road ahead is empty, but the stones remember footprints. The ledger remembers entries. The black sails of her legacy make way for quiet dawn, and in that silence, her story remains curated, polished, eternal. The sun has long since slept beneath the rooftops, and now the air outside carries the soft chill of a world preparing to hush. You're in the study one last time, but the desk is cleared. No letters waiting, no ink-stained blotter, just a single, wax-sealed scroll placed precisely in the center of her last testament. You followed her through 20 nights of intrigue, strategy, grief, defiance, and calculated elegance, and now here, at the edge of her story, you finally understand what all of it was for. This wasn't about sorrow. It wasn't about survival. It was about authorship. Tonight is the final stamp of a life written entirely on her own terms. In 18th century Italy, wills were not just legal documents, they were narrative devices, especially for widows. Because once the performance is ended, once the mourning gown hung limp in the wardrobe and the salons closed their doors, what remained was legacy. A legacy could be sculpted, one clause at a time. The will was her voice from beyond, her last chance to reward loyalty, punish greed, settle unfinished arguments, and sometimes leave a perfectly curated mystery for future generations to squint at. Historians still argue whether widows' wills were exercises in emotional closure or strategic power, but anyone who's read them knows they were both. Some were poetic, others savage. One widow famously wrote in her will, "To my son Lorenzo, I leave the silver service. He never noticed it missing during Lent, and he won't notice my absence either." Another left her entire vineyard to a servant girl who had once braided her hair during an illness, bypassing 3 cousins and a bishop. The French tidbit? That vineyard's name was changed to La Trecha. The braid inn, it still produces wine today. The will also served as a woman's final lesson. It spoke to the younger women in her life, daughters, goddaughters, nieces. In one preserved document, a widow bequeaths her journals to her granddaughter with the line, "May you never be as quiet as I pretended to be." That's more than inheritance. That's defiance gilded in ink. Many left behind instructions for their funeral tone, yes, even in death. A widow maintained aesthetic control. One wanted no tears louder than the choir. Another requested only flowers that survive winter, as I did. These weren't eccentricities. They were posthumous performances. Final cues for the world's closing applause. But not every gesture was dramatic. Some were gentle. A music box left for a niece. A hand mirror for a neighbor's daughter who always admired it in secret. A collection of poems marked for rainy days and courage. These soft moments reminded the world that behind every sharp nod, every cunning retort, there lived a heart that had adored, a woman who had tasted loss, built armor, and chosen tenderness anyway. There was also the financial reality. Widows often redistributed power through their wills, land, wealth. Dowries they redirected generational flow. Sometimes this meant undoing damage. One widow used her will to release a distant cousin from debt after the cousin's father had stolen from the family estate. Decades earlier, another revoked the noble title from a pompous nephew and gave the title deed to her steward. That steward, he opened a school for orphan girls. Her will had made her radical. Her legacy made her immortal. In rare cases, widows left nothing material only. Instructions. One left a letter instructing that every unmarried girl in her village receive a pair of shoes for Christmas so she might walk into her own future, not another's. That letter was read aloud each year by the village priest, long after her name faded from headstones. That's the kind of echo you can't pay for. You earn it by living deliberately and dying with punctuation. And here's what most never say aloud. The will was freedom. It was the one time no priest, no judge, no cousin could interrupt, no husband to correct, no children to guilt. Just her voice, her choices, her syntax. She spoke as the sole author of her own end. And when you've spent your whole life being rewritten by others, that final draft means everything. So as you glance at that scroll one last time, untouched on the desk, you sense what she's left behind. Maybe it's gold, maybe it's gossip, Maybe it's a sentence so sharp and tender it cuts across centuries. But what matters most isn't what's inside the scroll. It's the fact that it's hers, authored, final, uninterrupted, and in that, she doesn't just end the story. She reclaims every chapter that came before dot and now. As the last candle flickers low and the soft hum of night presses gently against the window pane, you let the story settle in your chest like a warm weight. The whispers of silk skirts, the sharp scent of lemon oil, the quiet pride behind every glance, all of it folds into stillness. You're no longer walking those cobbled streets or slipping through velvet curtained corridors. You're here, safe, eyes growing heavier, as her voice begins to fade into memory. Let it. Let the sound of her lace against marble become the hush of your own breathing. Let the echo of her carefully chosen words blur into the silence you've earned tonight. The drama is done, the stage is swept, but the truth lingers that she lived with more intention than she was ever given credit for. And in the dark, behind veils and vigil candles, she carved out a power all her own. Maybe that's what tonight was really about. Not just the widows of Italy, not just the inheritance feuds or embroidered threats, but about remembering how much can be done with so little permission, about what survives when no one's watching, about how quiet can be a kind of rebellion. So, you rest now, carrying that wisdom with you. Maybe tomorrow you'll forget the names, the footnotes, the family trees, but you'll remember the feeling, the soft, slow awe of someone who learned how to outlive everything except her own legend. Sleep comes easy now, like a curtain falling after a perfect final line, and a script. Sweet dreams.